Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Drydock, episode 378, part 2. Plenty more questions to be getting on with, so let's just launch straight into them. ACC asks, my grandfather served in the US Merchant Marines before joining the Navy and earning citizenship in World War II. I know they conducted convoy escort, but precious little details beyond that. Could you please give a brief introduction to the role and scope of the Merchant Marines in World War II, including a description of the citizen-foreigner makeup of the branch? So this question confused me slightly, so I'm going to hedge my bets with the answer, because as far as I'm aware, there wasn't an organization specifically known as the US Merchant Marines, plural. There was the US Merchant Marine, which was the organization that crews US-flagged merchant ships, and they definitely did have a reasonably large foreign component, because ultimately, of course, they are civilians crewing merchant vessels. However, the use of the term Marines, implying a more military context, and the fact you mentioned they conducted convoy escort, which obviously the US Merchant Marine generally didn't, because they were the ones sailing the ships that needed the escort, that makes me think that perhaps what you're referring to is better known as the US Navy Armed Guard, as that would fit the criteria that you mentioned. They're associated with merchant vessels, and they are providing escort services, albeit aboard the ships themselves. So essentially, if you see, let's say, a photo of a Liberty ship, and it's got, the 5-inch deck guns fore and aft, and maybe some anti-aircraft, dedicated anti-aircraft guns as well. Generally speaking, those guns will be manned by the US Navy Armed Guard in World War II. So they're specifically trained, and as the name suggests, they are actually from the US Navy as opposed to the Merchant Marine. And their job is obviously to keep a lookout for and shoot at enemy aircraft, enemy submarines, the occasional enemy surface ship, and they would very often cross-train with the crew to be able to give the crew a hand when necessary, but also teach the crew how to operate the guns just in case, because obviously there's a limited number of them, and if they get caught in a strafing run, well, it's better to spend a couple of hours, a few weeks beforehand, teaching one of the other regular crew how to use that gun so they can keep firing, than not. Now, the interesting thing about that is, of course, that while a foreign sailor, foreign citizen, can relatively easily join up with the US Merchant Marine either before or during the war, because, well, skilled sailors are always needed, and as I said, it's a merchant ship, you're not exactly giving away state secrets there. As a branch of the US Navy, the Armed Guard, technically speaking, at least at the very, very start of the US involvement in World War II, you had to be a US citizen to apply. That was kind of the default for the US military at the time. As far as I understand, you had to be a US citizen to join it, which is somewhat understandable considering you're handing over state weaponry to them. But very quickly, in 1942, and subsequently throughout the war with a series of other acts, they actually significantly relaxed the requirements of citizenship for joining the US military, initially to things like people who were foreign-born, resident in the United States but not yet citizens, then also expanded to countries that were allied with the United States, and so on and so forth. And so even in the, if you like, the regular rank-and-file US military, whether that be the US AAF, the US Army, the US Navy, etc., there were a portion of foreign-born people, whether or not they'd actually lived in the US for much time, if any, serving alongside their US citizen counterparts. And then towards the end of the war, the culmination of all of these bits of legislation that have been passed, which were essentially just, look, we'll take anyone who's loyal enough to serve in the military to a certain extent. Obviously, if you were from Germany, they might take a little bit of a closer look at you, but with that said, one of Hitler's relatives served in the US Navy, so obviously it was possible. And while you might think, oh, US Navy Armed Guard, therefore perhaps an easier branch of service, and not really, because of course you are still a gunner on a ship, except your ship is a merchant ship. It doesn't have armor, it doesn't have big guns, it's not surrounded by ships with lots and lots of guns. It's very vulnerable to damage, and, well, you are a prime target for pretty much every Axis aircraft, submarine, and surface raider that can get its claws at you. So it's actually quite a hazardous posting, and because, of course, if the merchant ship gets hit by a torpedo and goes down, well, you're going down with it. You better hope you know how to swim, and hope the Atlantic isn't as cold as it usually is that time of year. So there was a reasonably high casualty rate amongst the US Navy Armed Guard as well. As far as what exactly the citizen-foreigner makeup of the branch was, I don't know, and I suspect, given the progressive relaxation of restrictions over the course of the war, that ratio would have changed quite dramatically. So when it's initially formed, before that initial relaxation of rules comes into play, it would have been 100% US citizens, but I would suspect that by 44-45, there would have been a substantially larger foreign makeup, increasing as the war goes on. Although, of course, as you know, your grandfather transferred over to the Navy and joined and earned his citizenship that way. Which, he obviously, that was his choice. He could technically, via the changes in laws, have also earned his citizenship by staying in the armed guard. And, well, I hope that I've made the correct inference from your question. But, let me know. Elliot W. James asks, as a naval wargamer, I've noticed a number of rules for the Age of Fighting Sail have rules for national doctrine with regards to firing, with the British aiming into enemy hulls at longer ranges, while the Franco-Spanish aim to dismast their opponents. How far is this supported by documentation? Since the British favoured attacking with the weather gauge, could the effect of wind on the ship's hulls affect the fall of shot, with British guns tending to be somewhat depressed while their opponents' guns are somewhat elevated? There's a reasonable amount of documentation to support the general idea, especially when you contrast the British and French navies in the Napoleonic era, but with a few caveats. Obviously, individual captains might have specific ideas about how to fight their ships, so just because the ship is French doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of the time, historically, French ships would always fire at the rigging. If you have a particularly aggressive captain, or just a captain who thinks firing at the rigging is a stupid idea, they may very well end up firing at the hull. Likewise, in the middle of battle, you may change tactics. So, if you think, well, I'm up against an opponent who is perhaps faster and more agile than I am, and you're a captain of the Royal Navy, you might then decide, okay, first order of business, I'm going to try and slow him down, take out some of his mast and sails, and then I can more reliably get broadsides on him without the risk of being raked, at which point I'm going to load up chain shot, star shot, bar shot, and I'm going to be aiming at his sails rather than his hull. So, that also could happen. But in more general terms, the overall gunnery doctrine that the French seem to follow as a rule is to fire on the up roll, whereas the British tend to fire on the down roll, because obviously ships are rolling as they move through the ocean. And when you fire your cannon, whether that be earlier on where you're just touching the slow match to touch hole, or something like that with a significant delay, or later when you're using the flintlock mechanisms, even then there is a slight delay between when you when you initiate the firing sequence and when the gun actually fires. Just how long that delay is depends on your method of firing. So when they are actually firing in a coordinated manner, i.e. someone on the gun deck is calling out to actually open fire at a specific time rather than just firing as fast as you possibly can, as I said, the general British doctrine was to fire on what they called the down roll. So you'd wait for the ship to come up on the side that you were firing on, and then as you feel the ship start to shift and roll down, then you call out to fire. And then, obviously, because of that slight delay, that would mean that when the guns go off, they are going to be ideally either at level or pointing slightly down, because the ship's hull is rotating downwards, and thus you're going to hit the hull considerably more often. Obviously, this works at longer ranges. At short ranges, unless you're in a really bad storm, it doesn't really matter how much the ship's rolling or pitching. It's just you're going to hit slightly higher or lower on the hull. Whereas French ships seem to have tended to fire on the up roll, which means that if the firing sequence starts fairly early or the roll is fairly gentle, you're still going to hit the hull, but more often than not, you are going to end up sending rounds into the upper decks and the mast and rigging. And there was a certain degree of logical sense to both ideas, because for the British, they thought, well, if we fire into the hull, we dismount guns, we kill gun crews, we relatively rapidly diminish the enemy's ability to fire back. If the enemy's ability to fire back is diminished, that means obviously we take fewer casualties, so our available firepower goes down more slowly than theirs does, which means we gain a firepower ascendancy relatively quickly, and that increases as time goes on, which when you consider that the French were very often tooling around in 74s, while the British were still going around in 50s, 54s, and 64s, and then later on there was a fair number of French 80 gunners when the British had a lot of 74s, the idea of reducing the enemy's firepower as quickly as humanly possible makes a huge amount of sense. And as you mentioned, the British liked attacking from the weather gauge, because that meant they could either sit at range or they could close at will, and then there wasn't a huge amount the enemy could do, whereas the French, at least in the Napoleonic War period, tended to prefer fighting in the lee, because, well, the enemy either had to come to them or they had the opportunity to disengage. Although, again, individual choices by captains and admirals and the effects of the weather could change that. And, of course, the weather gauge, if you are fighting with the weather gauge, i.e. that is, the wind is coming from your unengaged side and blowing towards the enemy, that is going to heal your ship a little bit more, making hull shots more likely, whereas if you are on the lee side and you're engaging a ship that's towards the wind, then yes, obviously your hull will cant up slightly and you'll fire more towards the masts. But the French tactical thing, because the British one makes sense, but the French one also makes sense, because if you partially or fully dismast and de-rig your opponent, then your opponent is now slower and less agile than you, potentially fall on masts, may even cover his guns and reduce his firepower, and that gives you a lot more options in terms of maneuvering around your opponent to get raking shots, or if they are slowed and not particularly agile but still pretty vicious customers, you can just leave and they can't really follow you. So both ideas have logic behind them. It's just very different logic depending on the various thoughts and characteristics that go into the navies at that particular point. And in a war game, it does make sense to abstract that into just this side does this, that side does that, because as a general rule, it's fine. But obviously, with the big caveat that in historical events, while this is what you would normally find, you will also find a fair number of exceptions to that rule based on the various circumstances that we found and discussed earlier. Zeranami asks, I found reference to a new 6-inch gun under development by the Bureau of Ordnance late in World War II on NavWeps, but I can't seem to find any reference to it elsewhere. Do you have any information on this successor project to the 6-inch 47 caliber Mark 16 gun that was found on the Worcester class? I would say, can you provide me with the link to the reference? Because this would be the first I've heard of it, and I'd be very interested to chase it down if indeed it is a thing. Now, I do know that there were proposals for new mountings for the 6-inch 47 dual-purpose gun as found in the Worcesters. These guns did have some fairly significant reliability issues, so I know that there were proposals for a new revised twin or two-gun mounting. Depends on exactly what terminology you want to use, but there is some suggestion it would actually be a twin, i.e. both guns fixed together rather than a two-gun mounting, which I suppose, simplifying, might have solved some of the reliability issues, and there was some thought of putting those revised twin mountings onto older ships like the Clevelands, obviously replacing triples with automatic or semi-automatic twins. And there were also proposals to develop a triple turret, which would still take the 6-inch 47 dual-purpose gun, the Mark 16, but obviously with 3 barrels, and that would obviously mean that the mounting, the turret has a higher fire rate, because along with some changes to the internal mechanics, again, to improve reliability, if you have 3 semi-auto guns spitting shells out, that's going to give you more firepower than just 2. But at the moment, as far as I'm aware, those were the only planned, if you like, successors to the Worcester's guns. I'm not aware of a direct planned successor to the Mark 16 dual-purpose gun itself, i.e. a brand new weapon to go with those mounts. But, as I said, if you wouldn't mind popping me the link, either in the comments or by email or whatever, I'd be very interested in chasing down a successor 6-inch gun project's details, if indeed there is one. Aidan Lovecchio asks, did any navy use chemical or biological weapons with the ability to be shot out of the main guns of a ship, kind of like how the Iowa class had nuclear shells developed for it? And if so, were they ever used? Were they effective? And if not, why not? There were plenty of studies, especially in the interwar period, around the use of chemical warfare from shells, i.e. usually poison gas. However, they all foundered, bar one, which I'll talk about in a minute, because of some actually fairly basic issues. Firstly was, well, ships move. So even if you had a high explosive shell with most of its explosive filler replaced by compressed poison gas, well, one, that's still not actually a huge amount of it, and two, if you miss, well, the ship's just going to sail away from the gas in a matter of seconds. So you've poisoned some air in the wake of the ship. Congratulations. I'm not entirely sure what you were trying to do with that. If you scored a direct hit with a shell that had a large amount of poison gas in it, and therefore would be more akin to a high explosive shell, well, all the vital functions of the ship are under armor, with the possible exception of the bridge. And so, well, again, you've kind of, you've poisoned a part of the ship that is going to be annoying going forward, but probably hasn't actually massively compromised the ship's ability to continue fighting. Unless, I suppose, maybe you hit an exposed anti-aircraft position or near an exposed anti-aircraft position and gas was everywhere. But even then, you could just, put what we would today call NBC measures on, whether that be just a gas mask or some other form of protective clothing, or you just go inside for a bit. And this also comes across another rather important problem, which is that if you have, by the luck of the gods and the roll of the dice, managed to score a direct hit on an enemy capital ship with a shell, which, bear in mind, relative to the number of shells you fire, is actually a relatively rare event. If that shell is a poison gas shell, you have mildly inconvenienced the enemy. If that shell was an armor-piercing shell, you may have majorly inconvenienced the enemy. And thus it would be better to just fire an armor-piercing shell. And that basically was why most of these experiments died. They just weren't particularly effective compared to flinging a very large, slightly aerodynamic lump of steel with a small amount of explosive in it. However, there was one nation that did technically deploy chemical warfare within their shells, or at least the capability for chemical warfare, and that was the French, hence why we've had the picture of Richelieu up. And they actually deployed 15-inch shells that had a cavity in the base in which could be attached a small canister of poison gas. Now, this wasn't going to cause massive casualties across the ship. From what I can tell, it seems to be more along the lines of making damage control efforts somewhat more difficult because, as I said, the amount of poison gas in there is not huge, but it would linger in the compartments that have been damaged by a shell hit. So, obviously, if you had damage control crews going to try and shore up a hole in the hull that the shell has just punched, and they go in and, oh, look, there's lingering mustard gas or whatever it is they were deciding to fill up the shell with, then obviously that could be a major problem. Now, of course, you could again overcome that with protective gear. That is going to slow you down, make you more clumsy. You might suffer initial casualties if you don't realize that there is poison gas in there. So it is going to slow down your effectiveness in terms of repair and patching up, but it's not an insurmountable problem. But it might be worth it for a very small edge case value. But in the end, they never actually ended up putting the poison gas in the shells because, well, especially in the aftermath of World War I, resorting to chemical warfare would invite some rather dramatic countermeasures from your opponents. And as it turned out, the shells were in part responsible for the number of failed premature detonations and other issues that the Richelieu's had initially, because it turns out if you didn't have the chemical warfare canister in there, well, now you had a void space where pressure could build up when you fired the shell, and then that thinner part of the shell's base could fail, and thus you get premature shell detonations. So in the end, it was a lot more trouble than it was actually worth. Scott Jennings asks, in Drydock 373, you talked about the Royal Navy's response to the influence of sea power upon history, and mentioned how some naval strategists seem to get to the part about decisive battles and then stop reading. While Kentai Kessen is probably the largest scale demonstration of this, I get the sense it isn't the only one. Can you give some other examples of navies whose strategies were informed by a shallow or otherwise flawed understanding of Mahanian doctrine? And do you have any thoughts on why the greater point of Mahan's writings, that command of the sea was what actually mattered, has a tendency to be lost? Well, looking at the latter part, I get the feeling that the reason a lot of people seem to stop reading at the fight decisive battle, therefore win element of Mahan is partly because that's the flashy, glorious bit, leading your fleet into glorious battleship line combat against another fleet and emerging the victor. You've smashed the enemy down or forced their surrender, in the case of Tsushima. You are now the dominant force at sea. You've done your duty as a military officer. The enemy cannot stand against you. Tea medals or sake medals or bourbon and medals or schnapps and medals, depending on your national preference, all around. It attracts a lot of attention. The boring bit about, protecting merchants and convoying your goods and making sure that the arteries of trade are coming to your country and denying them to your enemy with potentially long blockades, that's a lot less exciting, and it's not something that a lot of people would look forward to as regular duty. And then you combine that with the fact that what's easier to sell to the politicians? It's relatively easy to sell to politicians and treasuries the idea of, we build big fleet go boom, enemy fleet go kaboom, we win, this good for country. Politicians and treasury officials tend to have just enough brain cells between them to roughly comprehend that concept. Whereas if you then go on and try and explain, we need big fleet for big boom, but we also need fleet of cruisers for protective trade, and we need trade because brings goods and money, and we need to stop trade to the enemy because then enemy doesn't have goods and money, and then enemy sad, and sad enemy lose, and we win. You see, you've already used far too many words and far too complex words for the average politician on the street to actually comprehend what the heck you're on about. And then when you start explaining that, yes, blockade duty and escort duty take time. Time is money. And then treasury officials go, oh no, money! Can't possibly spend that to help our nation out. Money belongs in treasury vaults. And yeah, then it all falls apart. So, yeah. And to be honest, I'm not even exaggerating that much. That is literally a précis of quite a few different conversations that naval officers had with various government officials. So they very quickly learned that essentially selling the fleet as a battle fleet that will bring national glory very quickly and everybody waves the flag and feels good about themselves was a much easier way to sell procurements to governments than, well, there's this very long and complicated strategy based around trade blockades and winning dominance of the sea, and it's going to take years, and oh yeah, you've stopped listening, haven't you? So that's a good chunk of the problem. I mean, heck, even in Britain, where that is exactly how Britain had won command of the sea and won wars repeatedly during the past couple of 100 years, where you had full worked examples from history that you could show to people and big glorious paintings that showed it and everything, even then it was sometimes difficult to persuade the government that yes, you did actually have to fight something a bit more than just a grand fleet battle. Now, in terms of other navies whose strategies were informed by a somewhat misunderstood idea of what Mahanian doctrine actually entailed, I would say actually The High Seas Fleet and the US Navy circa World War One both had this to limited degrees, some more so than others. The High Seas Fleet, I think, was probably a very good example of somewhat misunderstanding things, because obviously you have Tirpitz's risk fleet theory, that by being strong enough to hurt the Royal Navy will give you what you want to avoid fighting you, which is actually completely contrary to what Mahan says, because Mahan is basically like, no, if somebody threatens you, you need to build a really freaking big fleet and make sure that they absolutely regret doing that, which is basically what the Royal Navy committed to. But on top of that, you then obviously have their wartime strategy of isolate a portion of the Grand Fleet, destroy it, and then confront them on a more equal footing, then win. But it's a classic example of, question mark, question mark, profit? Because the entire German strategy seemed to be, well, if we destroy the Grand Fleet, then the Royal Navy will have to do what we want because we've won. There wasn't a grand plan to go and sweep the oceans with cruiser warfare to destroy Britain's ability to actually conduct commerce. Bearing in mind, when they came up with the strategy before and during the early part of World War One, they didn't think that the U-boats were going to be anywhere near as effective as they ended up being. So don't mistake yourself for thinking, oh no, they were hiving off the cruiser warfare bit to the U-boats. They just seemed to think that if they destroyed the Grand Fleet, Britain would cave. Ignoring the fact that even if you did destroy the Grand Fleet as a fighting force, there's still going to be quite a lot of ships, especially cruisers and so forth, out there to protect British trade. The High Seas Fleet is not really set up to go out and interdict trade or blockade the British coast, and the German fleet doesn't have anywhere near enough cruisers to go out and attack even the remnants of the British fleet out on the high seas to, fully cut off commerce. And I would say to a lesser degree, the US Navy, certainly in the run-up to and during World War One. Now, some of that was compounded by the fact that Congress wasn't prepared to give them more than 3 nickels and a dime every couple of years. But when you look at the construction of the US Navy, both in terms of, obviously, for obvious reasons, being fairly capital ship heavy because of those funding restrictions, but then when you look at what they were designing in terms of cruisers and destroyers, and then what they ended up building in terms of cruisers and destroyers, once the funding, got a little bit more generous. And even when you look at a lot of their early fleet problems, early to mid-fleet problem exercises in the interwar period, the US Navy seems to be centered almost entirely around the whole fleet is constructed as a battle fleet. The destroyers, the cruisers, even the battlecruiser designs, they're all very much emphasis on speed. Yes, they have range because they're thinking about fighting in the Pacific, but their primary design emphasis for those ships is on speed, scouting for the battle fleet, bringing the enemy to bear, or bringing the fleet to bear on the enemy, fighting a big battle, destroying the enemy fleet. And there's not really a huge amount in that doctrine to do with what you do afterwards. It's kind of assumed again that once they lose their fleet, you will win. And what they end up building, like the Oberhaas and so forth, really aren't suitable ships for commerce raiding or blockade duty. They are fast fleet scouts and pretty much that. Jim Smitty asks, in your interview with Brett Devereaux on the sad decline of historical departments in the Anglo-American university world, you briefly showed off some primary source material you've come to own. I'm wondering, how did you come to own primary source material? As I would think it would have been in some government warehouse. And further on this topic, how much primary research do you do for the channel? Is there another book waiting in the wings to be released? Okay, so there's 3 parts to that question. I'll take the middle one first. How much primary source or primary research do you do for the channel? It depends on what the topic I'm covering is. So, for example, if I'm doing 5-minute guides, to be honest, the vast majority of ships and classes covered in the 5-minute guides, they have enough relevant information that has been compiled by secondary and tertiary sources, the Conway's, All the World's Fighting Warships, the warship journals, the various British battleships, US cruisers books, etc., etc. Those exist they've got enough detail, the authors are good, the bibliographies are good, yeah, so you can create 5-minute guides from that. Occasionally, that's not so much the case, because, for example, what on earth was Jackie Fisher thinking when he was designing Incomparable or the Dreadnought armoured cruisers? There are articles about that, to be sure, but if you want to get the full intricacies of the man, you pretty much have to read what he wrote on it. And, well, at that point, you go out and find copies of his works, and then you own them, because they were published, and they are around. Obviously, once you get into the deeper topics, the sort of the Wednesday and the Friday topics, that's when more primary research material comes in. And that can be, reading papers that have been done researching specific elements of things. And I'm not talking about, here is my paper on the conduct of Japanese admirals in World War II, because obviously that's not a primary source. I'm talking about things like, say, for example, if we're talking about the development of naval armor, obviously I've got my university course notes and papers as well, but a paper that's, here are the phase diagrams on the creation of hardened steel. That is primary research, so I would count that as a primary source. It's basically the next best thing to me actually just going out and somehow acquiring a major steel forge and physically making the stuff. And for example, for Operation C, the Indian Ocean raid, now again, there are references to that whole thing in passing in various books and articles, but at the time that I was putting the whole thing together, I could only find one pair of books that was kind of covering the first and second half of that raid by the same author that actually specifically looked at the Indian Ocean raid as opposed to covering it as part of a larger element. And therefore I was like, okay, well, as much as the book seemed to be, and as it turns out was, very well written and very well researched, it's still one book. And I can't in good faith go on just the one book. So then it was off to Q, and as I've mentioned in a few videos before, basically going, I want everything from the Eastern Fleet for about a year's time period centered on the time of Operation C. Several thousand pages of scans later, going through all of that, putting it all together. That's basically how you end up with the Operation C video. And once again, I will highly recommend those two books published by Hellion. I believe the links are in the descriptions for those two videos on Operation C, because one of the ways I knew it was a really good set of books was the fact that while I was going through all the actual primary documents, the Royal Navy reports and deck logs and intel assessments and so forth, and then I was going through the book, which obviously covers the Japanese perspective as well, I was seeing citations directly in the text, from Admiral Somerville saying, I want to do this, or it says, at this time, Warspite and Formidable did that. And then I'm like, hang on a minute, I know exactly where that's from. Switch back to my scans. Yes, that is cited precisely from this page in this Royal Navy report, which means that the author has absolutely gone and done basically exactly the same thing that I did and done all their primary research, and they're reporting it accurately. Therefore, I know this book is really, really good. As I say, really would recommend those books, actually. So that gives you an idea of perhaps one of the more primary research-led videos. And then it will vary back and forth, again, depending on how much information is out there in good quality books already, how many books are there, how much can I cross-reference, and how much do I need to double-check. And also, as hopefully you've probably recognized during some of my longer histories, like the Enterprise series or the British Pacific Fleet series, sometimes I go for the primary research material, not because the events, the technical events, who did what and where in terms of shipping, haven't been covered well elsewhere. They have been, but because very often when you go into the reports and the personal logs, the deck logs, etc., say the primary material held in archives, that's very often where you find the personal touches, because, if somebody writes an account of, I don't know, the Battle of the Coral Sea. So there'll be books on Coral Sea, and they'll very often be very good books on Coral Sea, but they will tend to focus more on the intelligence picture, what the various ships were doing, what the admirals were thinking, what planes took off when, who they saw, all the stuff that is the general history of the Coral Sea. What you won't find in most books is what the pilots were thinking at the time, what they were briefed on. Let's say they were briefed to go and attack this, but what was actually said at that briefing? What were the pilots doing, and what were the ship's crews doing during their training and working up on their way to the battles? All of that kind of stuff, a lot of the time tends to be left out, obviously for brevity. But when you look at the primary source material, you very often come across that kind of stuff. And I like including it to give everything a little bit more of a human touch. Plus, you can find some absolutely hilarious stuff, like when I did the video on the near sinking of USS Pennsylvania toward the end of the war. I went and dug up all the ship's logs for that time period, because one, those were pretty much the only things that gave extensive detail on what actually happened, but two, the continual injuries that the Pennsylvania crew seem to be managing to inflict on themselves just through regular day-to-day maintenance. I mean, obviously it's not very funny at the time for them, but you literally have stuff that sounds like comedy sketches where people are trying to fix something, they slip, they fall, they get hit by a big metal plate, they fall because they've been hit by the metal plate still further, then something falls onto them because they've brushed it on the way down, and then they fetch up, landing on a deck 15 feet below, and get carted off to the infirmary. Fortunately, obviously, making a recovery. But the whole sort of almost Rube Goldberg sequence of things going wrong for that poor chap is very amusing to read when it's not happening to you. Now, with that said, how do you come to own primary source material? A mixture of luck and knowing where to look. So antique shops, people with big collections who are selling them off either due to age or because some relative has died. And again, also hunting on places like the internet and stuff. So I've got signal books for HMS Repulse from the Empire cruise and the training immediately before and after. I've got logbooks of various battleships and cruisers from the 1890s and 1900s. I've got a 17th century manual by a French knight on how to besiege star forts and how to build star forts to defend against them. These are all original materials. Diaries, journals, annotated training manuals, all this kind of stuff. Basically, if I see it and it's not going to cost the absolute earth to buy, I'll tend to just go, yep, I'll have that. And it can, and also obviously stuff like training manuals from as far back as the 1700s, because they actually existed back then, believe it or not, for things like gunnery. Just picking them up and going, yeah, well, this is the original document. This is what they would have used. These are their thoughts. Let's read about them and build on that. And I know this answer is going on for a little bit. I do apologise, but it is a fairly complicated question. As far as is there another book waiting in the wings to be released, I'm actually kind of working on two or three book projects at the same time, trying to put together the source materials for most of them, to be perfectly honest. So one of the book projects is actually a pair of books, which what I want to do, they're kind of be more sort of, if anyone remembers them, the old DK series that offers a reasonable amount of explanation, but there's also a lot of pictures, a kind of coffee table books, but in a lot of detail on classes of ships. I want to do one for the age of sail, one for the age of steel and steam. So it's kind of like, if you've ever wanted to know what is a sloop, what is a frigate, why is a frigate called a frigate, what's the difference between a corvette and a sloop, or a brig, what's the difference between a brig and a brigandine, what makes a sixth rate, a fifth rate, a third rate, a first rate, what were the equivalent in foreign navies, all of that kind of thing. That would obviously be in the age of sail, and then for the age of steel, what is a cruiser? Why are there first, second, and third class cruisers? What's the difference between an unprotected, protected, and armoured cruiser? What are the equivalent in foreign navies? All of that kind of thing. That would obviously be in the age of sail, and then for the age of steel, what is a cruiser? Why are there first, second, and third class cruisers? What's the difference between an unprotected, protected, and armoured cruiser? what is a battleship? What's a pre-dreadnought battleship? What's a dreadnought battleship? What's a super dreadnought battleship? What's the difference between a torpilleur and a contre-torpilleur? All of this kind of thing. So you'd be going through and going, this is the page or the double page spread or 4-page spread on this is what destroyers are. That kind of thing. So that's a book I have, or pair of books I have ambitions to write at some stage. I'm kind of actually trying to tabulate the sheer number of classes that I have to cover, to be perfectly honest at this point. A medium-term project I'm working on is a much more expansive biography of Admiral Cowan. He's the guy who ended up, despite being a Royal Navy officer, ended up with the Royal Marine Commandos in World War II fighting an Italian tank with a pistol. Go figure. But he has actually a very, very interesting life. But sadly, he did publish an autobiography in the immediate aftermath of World War II, but there's actually more information about what he got up to purely in the interwar period in Admiral Cunningham's biography than there is in Admiral Cowan's entire autobiography. So I found out where his papers are, and I've got a copy of his autobiography, and I've got a copy, obviously, of Admiral Cunningham's autobiography, and I'm now expanding that into Royal Navy reports, both their reports on Admiral Cowan in terms of his service records and so forth, as well as Royal Navy reports into the various incidents and commands that Admiral Cowan was assigned to try and build the picture up considerably more. I have also tried to work out if he had any descendants. It appears, sadly, as far as I can tell, that he didn't. And even, relatives, like descendants of his siblings, don't appear to be particularly extant. But I think it's certainly a book that would be very, very interesting, if for no other reason than it gives me a glorious excuse to commission artwork of a admiral in his 70s in the North African desert firing at an Italian tank with a pistol, because that's quite cool. And then the long term, this probably 4 or 5 year project that I want to do is a really big, detailed, Norman Friedman, Burt, or R.A. Burt style book on the uncompleted capital ship designs of the interwar period. So basically, starting with the end of World War I, so not including Germany, because of course at the end of World War I, Germany has to stop designing capital ships, but from the end of World War I to the collapse of the treaty system and, the resumption of capital ship building period, with the North Carolinas and King George V, that period, I kind of want to do a book that details all of the major considered capital ship designs for the various navies. Now, whether I have to then curtail that to just maybe the big three, Britain, the US, and Japan, or whether I can also fit France, Italy, etc., in there, depends on how much access to material I can get and how big the book ends up being. But realistically, I would like to do that because, yes, you've got the N3s, G3s, their stuff, the South Dakotas, the Lexingtons, the Amagis, the Tosas, that kind of stuff. But you also have the stuff that's really not written about all that much, like the number 13s, the initial designs that were going to theoretically succeed the Lexingtons and South Dakotas, Battleship 16A, which was what the Royal Navy would have built had the treaty system lapsed in 1930. And then, of course, you get the Second London Naval Treaty, what everyone else was going to build. The Congo replacements that Japan was planning, the battlecruisers that the Italians were looking into. Now, a reasonable amount of all of this has been covered to a certain degree in various other books, but as far as I'm aware, no one's put it all together in one place and expanded on it in extreme detail. In part, even where it is covered in other places, a lot of the time it's kind of like, here's what they actually built. Now, very briefly, here's what they didn't build and, basic specs and so on and so forth and why. And now we're on to the mid-1930s. It's not to say that some of those good authors don't cover it in a reasonable amount of detail, but it's part of a much larger narrative, so therefore they can't necessarily cover it in as much detail as, ships that were actually built. I'd like to change that and just focus purely on the ships that were never built and, bring it all together in one nice collection. It's going to take forever to do because every time I think I've got the list ready to go and I'm gathering primary materials for them, I keep coming across even more designs that various people came up with. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess that's another lot of stuff I'm going to have to try and dig out of somebody's archives. Eric Van Dooting asks, did the long build times of the major ships of the Japanese Maru 3 program have a significant impact on when the Japanese felt comfortable beginning hostilities with the US? For example, did they at least want the Shokakus in commission before war broke out, or was it more of a historical coincidence that Pearl Harbor happened when it did? If they'd built a couple of follow-on Hiryu-type carriers, could we have seen a war break out 6 to 12 months later? I don't think the build times of the Maru 3 ships had any particular impact on the Japanese decision of exactly when to go to war, other than perhaps in very fine detail, when they've decided, yes, we are going to war, then going, well, let's just get this one commissioned and up to speed. So you might be talking about variations of a few weeks or a few months, but not much more than that. And it's far, far more to do with the fact that Japanese didn't really want to go to war with the US, particularly because they knew that even with all their best laid plans, they would be on the back foot. What they wanted was obviously to build an empire in the Western Pacific, but they were also realistic enough to know that the US would probably step in and try and stop them at some point. But essentially their plan was, we're going to try and get away with it for as long as we possibly can, but we then will have an ever-evolving plan to deal with the US as and when it becomes inevitable that we have to. What really pushes Japan into war at the exact point that they are, in going off to declare war on the US, is the US reacting to what Japan is doing, because the US is essentially initially going, oi, Japan, knock it off with the empire building. We don't like that. Japan kind of goes, yeah, sorry, didn't hear you. They keep doing it. And then the US, no, we really, really mean it. And the Japanese essentially doing the diplomatic version of, and what are you going to do about it? All the way over there on the other side of the Pacific. And in terms of things that actually worked, as opposed to the angry letter phase of things, the US starts imposing a series of economic sanctions, to which the Japanese kind of go, for most of them, well, that's annoying, but honestly, we can trade with other people, even if it costs slightly more. So if that's all you're going to do, well, have at it. And then the US puts an oil embargo on them. And that's a bit of a problem because, the US is the biggest oil supplier at the time, and the Japanese war machine needs an awful lot of oil and petroleum products, as does Japanese industry. And yes, of course, the Dutch East Indies exist, but there's no way that they can sustain their current war effort, both in terms of quantity of oil consumed and economically speaking, in terms of cost, with just doing normal commercial trade for the Dutch East Indies, especially because obviously the US can put pressure on the Dutch government in exile. And, well, if that's the only game in town, everyone's going to anticipate the Dutch putting some prices up. And so the Japanese are left facing the very real possibility of just flat out running out of fuel. And that starts a ticking timer of, okay, we need to go and seize the Dutch East Indies and various other places in order to secure at least a fuel supply. Of course, if you seize the Dutch East Indies, then you have the entire output essentially at cost, which is a lot better than if you were trying to trade with them, from an economic perspective at least. But you have to launch that conflict while you still have enough of your existing oil stocks to prosecute that conflict successfully. If you do go and take the Dutch East Indies, of course, that obviates the US embargo. You know that the US isn't going to stand for that, therefore they will take military action, in your estimation. And, well, the Philippines is in the way anyway, so you're going to end up attacking them, period. So in that case, if you know all of this, then when you are ready to go and take the Dutch East Indies, then the first thing you have to do is cripple the American ability to respond to you soon, and thus you get Pearl Harbor. So essentially, the whole thing is built out of a cascade of the Japanese needing oil. Not so much anything to do with their specific shipbuilding program. The Japanese would have far preferred to either not have to go to war with the US or to go to war with the US somewhat later than they historically did. But in the end, well, the US backed them into a corner. And to be fair, before anyone gets very angry in the comments, I'm not saying it's the US's fault that there was a war in the Pacific. The Japanese knew that their actions would cause a war in the Pacific. It was just a matter of when. and the US acted in its own national interest. But part of acting in its own national interest was to try and back Japan into a corner, as I say, to make them stop. It's just that they hadn't quite anticipated that Japan's response to being backed into a corner would be to lash out quite the way they did at Pearl Harbor. At least the political levels didn't seem to comprehend that. I have a feeling some of the US military had a fair idea that something like that was probably going to happen. David S. Speaks asks, Hola Alejandro, now that you've spent 2 weeks in Japan, 3 weeks actually, you can answer this pressing question. Is Yamato pronounced Yamato, or is it Yamato? Yamato written in hiragana is Yamato, which leads me to believe it's pronounced that way. Now, I'm fairly sure, and I'm pretty sure those who speak and understand Japanese a lot better than me will confirm that there is a proper way of pronouncing this. But as with pretty much every country, Japan is not a planet of hats. They are not all identical clones. And so you have regional accents and variations on pronunciation, which mean that you have a variety of ways that are used. Now, to be fair, when I was in Kure, the vast majority of announcements, audio recordings, etc., that I heard had said some variation on Yamato, or so not a to, but a to sound. I suppose much in the same way you would say tosa, not tosa, or chitose rather than chitose. However, in the broader spectrum of things, as I said, there are regional accent variations, so I did hear different emphasis on different parts of the hiragana. So I did hear Yamato, Yamato. I'm going to guess the slightly more clipped Yamato is the more correct, because I say that was the more common one. But it's the same thing with Mikasa. I've heard people call it Mikasa, Mikasa, so a mi instead of a mi sound. Sometimes the ending a is quite short, sometimes it's quite long, so it could be Mikasa or Mikasa. I've heard, again, both. So, much as in the UK, English has different pronunciations every 20 miles or so, or watch the furball descend when you try and work out what is the correct American way of pronouncing Nevada, because it's been Nevada, Nevada even has also been stated by Americans. So yeah, there's a correct way, but then there's also variations which I suppose would be not entirely technically incorrect, because after all they are being pronounced by native speakers. Lawson Say asks, you've mentioned you've gradually come to the opinion that the dreadful spread of the Littorio-class battleships, as occasionally experienced by them, is due to the excessive overstabilization of the shells rather than poor shell quality itself. In this case, how did the Regia Mariner fail to notice this glaring design issue during gunnery trials on land, if not during training at sea? Surely they would have noticed the first 20 to 30 shells out of each barrel not going where they wanted. Well, you've got to remember that during this time period, when the Italian Navy is deploying its newest and most modern ships, they've designed a whole series of different brand new naval guns, and a lot of them are running into various issues when it comes to accuracy. The 8-inch guns on the heavy cruisers, for example, they try to solve those problems through various means, and eventually one of those major means is just dialing back the amount of powder that they're using. So when they get into testing the Littorio's guns, the idea that some of those shells aren't necessarily going to go exactly where you want them to isn't going to be as big a surprise to them as perhaps it might be in other navies where they perhaps haven't had those issues quite as much. And you've also got to look into when exactly this is all being sorted, because the Littorio class, the first ship enters service in 1940. That's the same year Italy enters World War II. So essentially they're going to be running the initial acceptance trials and then obviously bring the ships into service pretty much in the immediate run-up to, and then for Roma and Vittorio Veneto during Italy's involvement in war. So even if they notice something's a bit off with the spread, it's not like peacetime where they can go, that's weird. We should probably investigate that further. They're going to go, okay, That's not brilliant. What can we do to fix that in the short term? Because we really cannot afford to take all of this back and redo it again, because, the whole we're at war bit. And when they're doing the testing, obviously, assuming that the theory is correct, then the shell spread is going to tighten up relative, as the barrel wears down. So they might look at the results and go, okay, brand new guns, brand new set of shells, not the best accuracy, that's not brilliant, but hey, look, we've had a couple of dozen salvos, and now everything seems to be working perfectly fine. So I guess maybe the guns needed just to be shot in a little bit. Problem solved. Hopes, dreams. Off we go to war. And I have a feeling that's probably a good chunk of what was going on. Whereas if perhaps the Littorias had been commissioned a couple of years earlier, you would have had more extensive testing and potentially some fixes developed the same way that the 8-inch guns on the heavy cruisers were tested and fixed to a certain degree. Snowstalker36 asks, with the introduction of the CIC in World War II, I've heard there was extensive debate on whether the captain's place was on the bridge guiding his ship with his eyes, or in the CIC guiding the ship with sensors. How heated was this debate, and how was it decided? It got relatively acrimonious at times, and most of that acrimony was kind of back and forth between people on the front line and people back at home, because for the people back at home stateside, they were looking at it going, look, we've got a whole bunch of fairly highly specialized, highly trained technicians and potentially a lot of fairly sensitive equipment. Therefore, we don't really want them in an exposed position, like, say, high up in a superstructure, where almost anything could take them out. So, at least on ships that have substantial armor protection, like battleships and some cruisers, it makes more sense to have the CIC down below, where they're protected from all but the worst of incoming enemy ordnance, and if they have anything that they need to say to the captain, then they can call up via the internal communication system, and this should all be fine. Obviously, for things like the more lightly protected cruisers, I mean, exactly which cruisers this applied to varied over time, depending on the discussion in question, and also destroyers, when they eventually get a CIC. Effectively, there is very little point in putting the CIC low in the ship, because there isn't really much protection down there that there isn't up in the superstructure, namely to say splinter proofing. And at that point, the only consideration really is weight and space of the equipment. Whereas frontline captains, for the most part, tended to prefer having all the information close to hand, because even if they weren't technical specialists who could necessarily understand it all, they preferred generally to be able to just take a step or two off the bridge and go, hey, what's going on? This. Okay, great, fantastic. Back on the bridge, make decision, off we go. Because ultimately, if a CIC has half a dozen to a dozen people in it, the captain can step in and go, okay, what about this? Or what's happening over here? And the relevant people can sound off. They can tell him lots of different bits of information from different bits of equipment, and that allows him to make a decision a lot more quickly. Whereas, obviously, if he's relying on internal communications, he's relying on either the people in the CIC taking the initiative to phone him up and say, hey, this, and this is happening. And also, only one person can be on the phone at any one time. So he's either going to have to rely on an executive summary or multiple people coming to the phone one after the other, which is obviously very inefficient, and things could change while they're away from their scopes. So overall, although you can get a fair bit of information that way, it is fundamentally a less efficient way than just being able to step into the CIC because it's 4 steps behind the bridge or something like that. And in the end, it was decided mostly by, well, the people who were designing the ships back at home, who just went, as I said, if it's heavily armoured enough to be worth it, the CIC is going under the armour, and if it's not heavily armoured enough, the ship as a whole, to be worth it, and the CIC isn't too big, then, well, I guess we can put it up near the bridge where everybody wants it to be, with exceptions, obviously, for ships that had been in service before the CIC was developed, where the CIC tended to be wherever the captain or admiral in charge at the time of it being implemented decided it was going to be. Like, for example, with USS Washington, Admiral Lee, who was one of the front runners in developing the CIC, basically decided that he was going to have his CIC right behind the bridge, because he could just pop back and forth between them to gather what information he needed. And although I can't necessarily prove it 100%, I rather suspect that's one of the reasons why he really preferred Washington as his flagship as opposed to some of the later ships. He did obviously have his flag on some of the more modern fast battleships later on, but he was on Washington for quite a long time, and I would suspect part of that would be the location of the CIC. Alan asks, what was the process, from Totally Cold, of lighting the boilers and getting up steam in a pre-dreadnought battleship? Did they carry some other fuel like wood to get the boilers up to temperature so that the coal would burn? It seems like you do just about everything in your power to never have to relight your boilers. Yeah, pretty much, and this was actually brought home to me a lot by the steam school that I was attending over on the John W. Brown week or so ago at the time of recording. Now, obviously, John W. Brown, being a Liberty ship, uses oil fuel, which does complicate things a bit because you have a fuel pump. But even without taking into account the fuel pump, especially when you're looking at a pre-dreadnought, the vast majority of all the auxiliary machinery in the ship is going to be powered by steam, and you get the steam from the boilers. The problem is it's a little bit of a catch-22 because you need things like the condenser and then the boiler feed water heater and various filtering sections to get oil and stuff out of the boiler water as it comes out. All of that plus potentially steam power for generators and pumps bringing in water for the condenser. So not just the condenser itself, but pumping the water through the condenser from the sea to provide the cooling temperature. All of that is going to be steam powered. But, the catch-22 being that if the boiler isn't lit and there isn't steam, you can't run the auxiliary machinery. And therefore, without the auxiliary machinery running, you can't run the engine. So you've got to get steam from somewhere because you've got to fire up the auxiliary machinery to allow you to run the engine and the main steam circulation. And once you've got the steam circulation running, you can run the boiler, which generates the steam that you needed to power the machinery. So you can see the kind of the problem. This is why some ships would have small auxiliary steam boilers, which were much easier to bring up to speed, and there's no way they could run the engines, but they could generate enough steam pressure to run the auxiliary machinery, which would allow you to bring up the main drive, if you like, the main boilers. But the main counter to all of this was simply, as you said, never have to actually relight all the boilers. Now, you might let some boilers go cold, but you would always keep at least one boiler running, maybe two, so that you had some steam pressure going, because that one boiler might not be enough to get you underway, but it will provide enough steam pressure to run your general machinery that you need, perhaps also your electricity to keep the ship lit, and the auxiliary machinery that's needed to keep the rest of the machinery running so that you can actually then fire up the rest of the boilers. If, for some reason, you have nothing, your boilers are completely dead, there are two potential solutions if your ship is cold. One is shore steam. So they legitimately have this. They have boilers on shore. You can then hook steam lines up from those boilers to run the auxiliary machinery, get the temperature up, and thus you can then start firing up your boiler and the various other bits of machinery will work. Or two, if you don't have shore steam to connect to, and I don't know, maybe you're in some remote outpost in the middle of nowhere and for whatever reason your engines are completely out cold, then you are in a lot of trouble. But at that point, it's theoretically possible to do a cold restart, but it is going to take a very long time because it's going to take a lot of heat to heat up the vast amount of water that's in the boilers and bring it up to a point where you've got the steam that you need to kick everything off. And at that point, you would be using whatever you had that could burn. So they normally wouldn't carry specifically, here's a stack of wood that we will use to relight our boilers from cold, because you don't want to be in that situation ever. You would basically build a small fire from whatever you happen to have. So maybe wood you had for damage control, bits of furniture that nobody particularly liked, any rubbish that would burn, maybe say shore parties are sure to find burnable wood or whatever. You'd have to open up the boilers, build these little bonfires, get that initial bit of heat going, and then as that heat builds and you start to generate a little bit of steam pressure, then you can start shoveling coal and the whole process cascades. But if you're doing it completely and utterly from cold, with no assistance from shore steam, no assistance from auxiliary boilers that are just going to be running the auxiliary machinery, you could be talking days to bring a ship fully up to operational speed. I mean, even on the John W. Brown, which I say is an oil-fired ship, so it's much quicker and easier to bring up than having to do coal, and runs on a relatively low pressure. I mean, okay, pre-dreadnoughts probably running on a similar pressure. And given the fact that because they'd done some light-offs earlier, the water had been somewhat pre-warmed, it was still going to take, I think, something like 6 to 8 hours just to bring the machinery up from boiler light off to an initial stage where the engine could start to slowly turn over. And that was with a pre-warmed oil-fired boiler and some auxiliary machinery being run off external sources. Excelsior 1 asks, if the transom hull form had been developed earlier, say the early 1910s, would the early dreadnoughts and battlecruisers and cruisers have benefited from the design and hit higher speeds earlier than traditionally evolved? So to be clear, the transom stern has been around for a very long time, but was more usually found in smaller vessels. The particular way that the transom stern works, which I have covered elsewhere, essentially means that it's a very good solution for something like a fast battleship, like, of course, Vanguard. However, the benefits that the transom stern has for greater efficiency at higher speeds, and therefore potentially higher speed with less power, is also affected by the fact that there are downsides to the transom stern, particularly when it comes to lower speeds, because it's all to do with the water flow along the hull, how that water flow detaches, what vortexes are formed, and where. And the slower the ship goes, the closer those vortexes come to being essentially attached to the hull, and that will create drag, which will slow the ship down. So when it comes to considering having a transom stern or not, what you have to consider is, well, basically two things. Firstly, how important is it for you to go really fast with a, relatively speaking, minimal amount of power? And secondly, how much are you going to be going around at a speed that is below that at which you start to get negative effects from the transom stern? Because obviously, exactly how large the transom stern is, what the hull form is, will affect that boundary. But let's say, for arbitrary reasons, that boundary is 16 knots. Just picking a random number. So, if you're going to spend 90% of your time, let's say, cruising at 12 knots, a transom stern probably isn't for you, because your overall fuel economy is going to drop quite considerably compared to a ship with a normal stern. And yes, you might be able to go a fraction faster in that small amount of time you're running at, let's say if you're a dreadnought, 21 knots. But is that really going to be worth it? Conversely, if you're a battle cruiser, you've got higher top speed, and let's say for shenanigan reasons, that crossover speed is still the same at 16 knots. Well, is your cruising speed as a battle cruiser likely to be 16 knots or higher? Well, okay, maybe now you're going to be borderline, so it might be worth considering. And then for a cruiser, well, obviously this gets very, very tricky, because immediately pre-World War One, some cruisers were only in the sort of mid-20s of knots, not much faster, and in many cases actually slower than battle cruisers. But then once you start to get into World War One, you do start to see cruisers in the 1910s doing 28, 30 knots or more. Okay, now, if you're going to be cruising at 16, 18 knots normally, and also running around at high speed quite a bit as part of a fleet screen or supporting destroy flotillas, now maybe having a transom stern does start to make a lot more sense. So you can see why I picked 16 knots, because it's a good way of demonstrating why a transom stern might work well for some types of ships and not others in the same time period. Now, if you don't care about fuel economy at all, and you're just like, no, I just want the maximum speed for my given power output, then sure, yeah, slap transom sterns on everything in the 1910s, and you'll probably eke another half a knot, 2 knots, depending on the design, out of your ships for a given amount of power. Just be prepared for the coal bill, or later the oil bill at the end. Greg M. asks, in your video on the Royal Navy and the Industrial Revolution, at about 28 minutes and 40 seconds in, there's a picture you've shown before of a group of naval officers. Who are these fine fellows? Are they anyone in particular, for example an admiral and his staff, or are they an illustration of naval officers generally? And if the latter, what was the original context or purpose of the picture? So it's not meant to represent any particular officer or group of officers. It's actually a kind of a helpful guide to illustrate the different dress and styles and rankings of a variety of different ranks of Royal Navy officer. And it was originally produced by an artist called Frank Dadd, D-A-D-D, who was quite a prolific British artist in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this was first published in a September edition of the newspaper The Graphic back in 1892. And it's actually part of a series of similar drawings, or lithographs to be more accurate, that he did around about that time, basically to help familiarise people with the Royal Navy. So there's another one showing Royal Navy Light Infantry, another one showing a variety of Marines, another one showing a variety of petty officers, and another showing a variety of regular sailors. Tradesman's Entrance asks, when did the post-war minesweeping efforts officially end in the major theatres of World War II? Was the goal to remove every mine laid, or just the ones in the major shipping lanes? It varied quite a bit, depending on, obviously, the theatre, but also what part of the various minefields you were trying to clear. So, for example, officially, the minesweeping off the German coasts ended in 1948. The minesweeping around Japan went on a little bit longer than that, but that was complicated by the fact that they thought they were sort of beginning to wrap it up, and then the Korean War happened, and it turned out a whole bunch of mines had migrated to the Korean coast, which wasn't great for the Allied warships operating off that coast. And then as currents changed, various mines started migrating back to the Japanese coast. So it was kind of an ongoing effort for quite a while there. And in the Mediterranean, there's lots of little different theatres, particularly the area in the Adriatic. That went on for quite a bit and actually cost a fair number of ships and either damaged or sunk. But broadly speaking, by the end of the 1940s going into the 50s, most of the areas were at least officially declared mostly clear. Now, the objective wasn't to remove every single mine laid, because it was appreciated that was basically impossible. So where you would try and remove every single possible mine would be in places like defensive minefields, like you can see here guarding a port, because at that point the locations of those minefields were very specifically charted, very specifically known, very accurately, and of course you don't want mines off your own port. So those they would aim to clear pretty much as completely as they could. And if they were wire controlled from the shore, sometimes they just blow the whole minefield and go, well, we know we got them now. Then, of course, you have the offensive minefields, where submarines, aircraft, ships deploying mines somewhere off the enemy coast. Now, those were a bit more of a problem, because you knew roughly where they should be, but with the way that navigation was at the time, especially if you're running in off an enemy coast at night, yeah, you might think you're roughly in the correct place, but whether that mine is there or whether it's several miles that way, who knows? And then you have the bigger defensive minefields where, well, we've seeded this area with mines, and over time some of those may have been dragged away by the currents. They may not be in the minefield at all. They may be in a different part of the minefield, and we've had to replenish them, and who knows how many have been hit, and so forth. So you'd know roughly the area you need to sweep, but not how many mines there would be or where they are compared to the very close-in defensive minefields. And so outside of these very close-in fields where you absolutely do know where they are, the general objective was to do a rigorous sweep and then multiple rigorous sweeps and satisfy yourself that we've got most of them, and especially obviously in areas near major shipping lanes, be very, very thorough about it, but also acknowledge that, well, there's a decent number that we may have missed, they may have drifted off, they may be doing their own thing, and there may be ones that where, we think they were deployed here, but actually, due to navigational errors, who knows where they were actually put. And that's assuming all the records survived from both sides and were consulted, which of course in some cases didn't happen because of bombing and so forth. So it was appreciated that despite their best efforts, there would be a certain number of mines still out there, and it was just hoped that they wouldn't cause too much trouble, which is why even today, although it is getting rarer in the 21st century, but you will still find random World War II mines popping up on the beaches for various reasons in various interesting places, and that was a lot more common back in the mid to late 20th century. Brian W. asks, in World War I, targeting was done optically and shell splashes were also judged optically. But with the advent of radar, you're targeting out of visual range of the enemy. How were splashes judged then? Was radar sensitive enough to see shell splashes? It depended very much on the range and the radar in question. Ultimately, if you were firing at very long range, well, as you know, shell splashes go pretty high, so even if the hull of the ship's below the horizon, you can still see the plumes of the shells, albeit you'd have to be one heck of a marksman to work out from some very distant plumes on the horizon and, say, the top half of a ship's superstructure, if you were anywhere close to being short or long or on target, unless you got some very lucky overlaps going on. Nonetheless, in, should we say, slightly closer conditions, but perhaps in fog, darkness, rain, all those other kinds of lovely vision obscuring situations, early radar, not really. Early radar, you'd get a bearing and a distance for a target, but the very earliest radars, sort of surface search and so forth, they were enough to cue you into roughly the right area, but you really wouldn't want to take radar range off of it. Certainly not with the hope of accuracy. Then you've got the second generation of radar. Now, that is sensitive enough to actually give you the correct bearings and ranges to an accuracy level where you can plug that into your fire control equipment. And that's the kind of radar, for example, that Prince of Wales had at the Battle of Denmark Strait. And that is sensitive enough to see the shell splashes separate from the targets. And indeed, that is exactly what Prince of Wales radar operators did the night after the Battle of Denmark Strait when they re-engaged Bismarck. But unfortunately, although they could see the shell splashes, the overlap and the resolution was still not quite good enough. So they came away thinking they had hit Bismarck because they'd seen the spike for the shell splashes overlap with the spike for Bismarck, but it turned out not quite. And then you have, if you like, third generation radar and onwards, where not only is it sensitive enough to see the shell splashes, but also the resolution is high enough that you can actually, even at relatively close distances, i.e. close distances between the shell splashes and the target ship, see more reliably if in fact you've hit the ship or not. Physical removal enthusiast asks, during the Boxer Rebellion, an Austro-Hungarian admiral was put in charge of the forced march to Peking. My question is, how much land combat training did naval personnel get, especially at times when boarding was no longer practiced? Well, boarding drill was practiced throughout the time that the channel covers. The actual act of boarding an enemy ship at sea became less and less common, at least for major warships, i.e., corvette, sloop, destroyer, and upwards. But there was still a reasonable amount of boarding practice, and particularly in the period that you mentioned, the Boxer Rebellion, the late 19th century, early 20th century, naval personnel actually got a surprising amount of land combat training, because in the late Victorian period, so the latter part of the 19th century, and also in the very beginning of the 20th century, obviously in the run-up to World War I, one of the major businesses of navies was actually enforcing the will of their home country on land with various naval landing parties. So ships would carry relatively extensive arsenals of equipment for land warfare. Rifles, supply packs, light field artillery, And as you see in places like the Boer War, also a number of ships had the ability to dismount some of their secondary guns and send those ashore in makeshift carriages. So, as naval landing brigades, there was actually a reasonable amount of competency with a lot of naval crews to form light infantry. And you see this in all sorts of things, with the Boxer Rebellion, the Boer War, etc., etc. At some point, I need to do a video about the Boer War and Percy Scott rocking up with, I believe it was HMS Terrible, could have been powerful, can't remember off the top of my head, one of the two, and then just going, aha, we are going to take our big naval guns and we're going to go all the way inland and then we're going to shell the Boers, because then this is going to be entertaining for us because, hey, they don't move and we're not moving either. They thought it was great fun. The British Army were under fire from advanced Boer field guns. Didn't think it was particularly fun until the Navy showed up and went, oh, we got bigger guns than you, haha, and started blowing up the Boer emplacements. Michael Imbezi asks, did the Jutland Scandal by Admiral Reginald Bacon and the Truth About Jutland by Admiral John Harper change the public's perception of either Beatty or Winston Churchill, due to the exposure of his evidently very poor scholarship of the battle, at the time they were published? There was a brief furore, and it may have led to a number of people changing their minds, but to be perfectly honest, by the time they came out, to a certain degree, the narrative of Jutland was set. And you also have to remember that when they were originally published, Beatty was still in the Royal Navy as a senior officer, First Sea Lord, for at least a good chunk of that. And yeah, that made outright criticism of him somewhat difficult, especially when you combined with the fact that, as I've noted in previous videos, if there was any time when Beatty actually did any good for the Royal Navy as a flag rank officer, it was in the post-war period, where he was able to leverage his political connections and, at the time, reputation, whether that be warranted or not, to try and benefit the Royal Navy, or at least, claw back some funding that otherwise would have been taken off of it during the relatively lean years of the 20s, and cascading on into the early 30s, even though he retired in 1927. I think the impact of both of those publications was probably more felt within the Navy itself, rather than in the general public, although, of course, there are always interested members of the public. Stafford Magnus asks, how were propeller shaft ports kept watertight? This is done by means of a propeller shaft gland or a packing gland, depending on your terminology, and essentially what this is the propeller shaft enters the hull, and at the point that it enters the hull, you have, well, a gland, but what does that look like? Well, it's a hollow metal cylinder with a flange, which obviously seals the actual entrance with the hull, bolted on or welded. It really doesn't make much odds depending on the time period in question. But if you start from where the propeller shaft enters the hull, there will be a small access point for grease, lubrication, more on that later. And then as you go further towards the machinery, so further forward in the ship, the cylinder or gland will flare out, and in that space, because now obviously you've got a gap between the inner walls of the gland and the propeller shaft, into that space will go packing. Now, depending on the time period and the size of the ship, that packing could be rope or some other kind of rope fabric-like material. In other cases, it was a somewhat soft metal, like a white metal. All sorts of things were used at different scales and time periods. But essentially, it's a form of packing material, usually in the form of a disc, and then multiple discs stacked one on the other. Then, going again further towards the machinery, so further forward into the ship, all of this packing material would be packed down into the gland around the propeller shaft, and there would be a threaded section to the gland and then a big bolt, obviously a hollow interior so that the propeller shaft can pass through, is placed over the packing material, and it's all bolted down really tight. So that forms the seal, because obviously whatever it is, it's soft and compressible. Now, of course, that immediately you might think, well, that's going to cause friction. Yes, it is going to cause friction, because it is providing a watertight seal, but obviously it's in contact with both the propeller shaft and the outside of the gland. That's where that little access point for lubrication comes in, because you would fill that up with lubricant, grease, or whatever it is you're going to use. That would percolate through both where the metal of the gland and the metal of the prop shaft are in immediately close proximity, and obviously also it will soak back through into the packing material, and that provides lubrication even though technically solid surfaces are in contact, much in a similar way to the way the thrust block to actually transfer the energy of the propeller into the ship works as well. And obviously you need to keep that tightened up because it might come a little bit loose over time with vibration and so forth. You need to keep the lubrication going, but you also don't want to over-lubricate it, because if you over-lubricate it, you can end up with everything running a little bit hot, which is not a good thing. But you do have to keep an eye on it, and actually sending somebody down every so often at a regular schedule to lubricate or oil up the glands and the propeller shaft, etc., was a regular duty on board a lot of ships. Volunteer per Order O'Sullivan asks, what courses were taught during the Selborne-Fisher Scheme? What were the specialities? Torpedo, gunnery, engineering courses, etc.? And were the courses the same as arithmetic and Latin? As far as I'm aware, the main purpose of the Selborne-Fisher Scheme was actually to give everybody exactly the same education at the newly built Britannia Royal Naval College, as you can see here. The idea of that was that prior to this, you had various separate branches of the Navy, and if you entered one, you were kind of ruling yourself out of the others, which, depending on which branch you entered, may or may not be seen as a bad thing. Particularly, one of the problems that the scheme was trying to address was the fact that engineering students were entering the engineering branch, but because they'd gone straight into engineering, they were basically never going to actually get to command a ship. And each of the various branches had their own different entry requirements. So you might, apply for one branch and fail, but exactly the same results might get you access to another branch. This was seen generally to not be a brilliant idea, and there was precedent for this in that the navigation used to be its own branch, but that had been folded into the main officer training course. So the idea of the Selborne-Fisher Scheme was to go, okay, get rid of all of this. We're just going to have one unified point of entry. Everybody gets taught the same thing. So, arithmetic, Latin, history, seamanship, etc., etc. And then once you finish your course at Dartmouth and you graduate, you become a sub-lieutenant, then you choose what specialization you want to go into, torpedo, gunnery, engineering, etc. So you would then leave Britannia, that being the college's name, and then you would head off to a combination of at-sea service and specialist training in different areas. So you might go to HMS Excellent or HMS Vernon, depending on if you were specializing in torpedo or gunnery, and so on and so forth. So under the core part of the scheme, where everybody receives the same basic education, you would have obviously some classes in the various specialities, but you wouldn't be particularly focused on those, because the main idea was to give everybody the same general education, some idea of what the specialities were, and then kick them out as sub-lieutenants, and then obviously promotion to lieutenant by board, and then you'd go on to work down your particular career path as you wanted. Salamin Shakia 93 asks, in Records by Admiral of the Fleet Lord Fisher, Chapter 12, Notes on Oil and Oil Engines, this chapter has the 1912 memo on incomparable, which was in your guide of said ship. Fisher wrote of internal combustion engines, oil engines, and diesel engines. Was incomparable supposed to be powered by this type of engine instead of steam turbines, as per what Solly described in his incomparable series of illustrations? Were marine internal combustion engines of the day potentially capable of producing the power that Incomparable needed, or were Fisher's claims about how a quadruple screw motor ship could have 80,000 horsepower with 16 of those cylinders cranked on each shaft, or a battleship carrying some 5,000 or 6,000 tons of oil in her double bottoms, sufficient to go around the Earth without refueling, were perhaps somewhat optimistic? Well, part of the problem is that Fisher, in his own wonderful way, is massively inconsistent by what he means by the oil engine. I mean, even if you read that single chapter of that one book, you can kind of tell that he's jumping around in defining what exactly an oil engine ship is, because at various points he's talking about an oil engine as in an oil-fired conventional ship with steam turbines, because he's advocating replacing coal with oil, which is a fair point. Then a paragraph later, he's talking about the oil engine in a context that's very clearly referring to an internal combustion engine, what we would see as a petrol engine or something similar to that. Then in another paragraph, he's clearly referring to what we would recognize as a diesel engine. And unhelpfully, not only does he refer to all three of these kinds of engines as oil engines, he also separately refers to internal combustion, diesel, and oil-fired steam turbines with their own separate designations. So he seems to have this general idea that if it uses oil rather than coal, great. But then, as he's wont to do, he goes off on several wild tangents about what exact application of oil there should be. Now, when it comes to some of his incomparable designs for the early part of the 1910s, given that he's talking about not having smoke, not having funnels, having extremely long range, and specifically where you mentioned this idea of having 80,000 shaft horsepower with 16 cylinders cranked onto each shaft, at that point he is fairly clearly talking about diesel power, because he's referencing a single cylinder 2,500 horsepower diesel engine, and he's basically saying, well, look, we just bolt a bunch of extra cylinders on. Although his maths is a little bit suspect, because if you multiply 2,500 by 16, you get 40,000. So if you've got 16 2,500 horsepower cylinders on each shaft, and you've got a quadruple screw ship, that's actually 160,000 shaft horsepower, not 80,000, but never mind. But in any case, this actually runs into exactly the problem they ran into with X1, which was people had this idea, certainly back then with diesel engines, that, hey, if you've got a diesel engine that produces a certain amount of horsepower per cylinder, in X1's case it was about 100 horsepower per cylinder, well then clearly if you just add additional cylinders, you just multiply up the power. And unfortunately, that's not quite how it works with diesels. Apart from anything, getting the timing right on 16 or 30 or however many cylinder diesel engine, that's a little bit of an ask. And accompanied with that is the vibration issues as well. Now, to be fair to him, at the sheer size that Incomparable was supposed to be, the square cube law might come into play, and even with the relatively not particularly power-dense diesel engine plants of the mid to late 1910s, you might still get away with providing a decent enough power plant for an incomparable size ship just through the sheer volume of the vessel. And range would obviously be very impressive, but I have a feeling that both power density and therefore the actual amount of space you need for the machinery plant and the overall range might fall a little bit short of Fisher's expectations, albeit, fast forward a little bit to later on in maybe the interwar period, and maybe you could pull it off at that point, again, just exploiting the colossal internal volume of such a ship. But this kind of illustrates the whole point of Fisher a lot of the times, the way the design of Incomparable bounces back and forth between all sorts of weird and wild things approximately every time he puts pen to paper. And I mean, on top of all this, bearing in mind that he's at this stage talking about the fast battlecruiser Incomparable with 32 knots, 20-inch guns and no funnels, I would like to draw your attention to this sentence within that chapter. Because, he's just described this monstrous battlecruiser, and then he goes, however, this type of ship is obsolete for the war before she has begun, as we've got to turn her into a submersible. Not that there's any difficulty in that. It has already been described that in August 1916 a submersible vessel with a 12-inch gun was proposed, that being obviously the M class, and then built. But he says, she's completely too late to take part in the war. She might have sunk a goodly number of the German fleet at the Battle of Jutland. And in the footnote to that, He says, only this morning, this being late November 1919, I have arranged to deal with the drawings of a proposed submersible battleship carrying many big guns and clearly a practicable production. So, yeah, if you thought the sort of, if you like, final form of incomparable with the 620-inch guns and the over 1,000-foot hull was a bit ridiculous, by 1919 he was trying to work out how to turn this into a submarine. Yeah, Fisher is an absolute mad lad. Slow Pixie asks, hello Drac, first question. I've recently taken a great liking to the Swedish 62 gunships of the line of the Kronprins Gustav Adolf class of 1780 as designed by Frederick Henrik af Chapman. I've read online, mostly on game forums such as Naval Action, that they were able to reach 11 knots, they were very stable with high gun ports from the waterline to allow them to fight in bad weather, and had an unusually heavy armament of 36 and 24 pounders. Do you have any more information on them? How good were they as ships in terms of durability, manoeuvrability, and firepower compared to other fourth and third rates of the late 1700s, and how would they have fared against US super frigates like the Constitution? They were pretty solid ships, and they were kind of responses to the fact that Sweden, when it was facing off against Russia, partly because of industrial limitations, partly because of the way the Swedish coastline is, they couldn't really afford to build really big first rates for the most part. They just wouldn't fit, much in the same problems that the Dutch had to a certain degree. And so they needed good, solid, slightly smaller ships that could punch well above their weight. Confusingly, they actually built another warship called Vasa. Obviously, the one in the museum sank. This is a little bit further down the line time-wise, obviously, being the late 1700s. And that Vasa didn't sink, and they decided to use that as the basis of the Kronprinz Gustav Adolf class, which is not to be confused with the Gustav IV Adolf class, which is a separate class of Swedish ship of the line from the 1800s. Yeah, go figure. In any case, they didn't actually start out with 36 and 24 pounders. They started out with 24 pounders and 18 pounders with the initial construction, which was an okay armament for a 62 gunner. It wasn't the heaviest, but it was certainly acceptable. But then, as time went on, I mean, okay, fair enough, Kronprinz Gustav Adolf herself didn't actually have a particularly long service career because she went aground after a battle, but nonetheless, shortly before that particular war, the Swedes decided, actually, you know what, we do need a much heavier punch because the Russians are running around with 100 gunners. And that's when they decided, okay, we're going to put 36 pounders on the lower gun decks, and we're going to move the 24 pounders up to the upper gun decks, and the 18 pounders are going to go away altogether. Now, in that configuration, obviously, slightly heavier armament, she's going to sit slightly lower in the water, but that is quite the broadside. I mean, it's still a 62 gun ship, but in terms of her lower and upper gun decks, that's now carrying the same weight of fire as the average first rate, and the difference being obviously that the first rate would then have a third gun deck that might carry either 12 or 18 pounders on top of that. But in terms of the really heavy smashing guns, you now have a 62 gunner that's got the core broadside of a much, much larger ship, and indeed, even a fairly well-armed 74 or 80 gunner is not going to have a huge amount of broadside advantage over something like the rearmed Kronprinz Gustav Adolf class, and in fact may actually be at a slight disadvantage depending on if they're running with, either in the French case, 36 pounders or British case 32 pounders on the lower gun decks, but they might be running with, say, 18 pounders on their upper gun decks for their third rates, and if they are, then the combination of 36 and 24 pounders might actually give the Swedish ship firepower advantage. Now, I suspect if they were out in the deep ocean, because of course they do have to be designed with the shallow and narrow Swedish waters in mind, they might not be quite as good deep ocean performers as something like the Constitution, or indeed like other fourth and third rates. However, with that absolutely ridiculous rearmed broadside battery, if for some strange reason you had a Kronprinz Gustav Adolf found out at sea and ended up falling in with Constitution-type super frigate, it's got a significant firepower advantage because, of course, one of Constitution and her sister's big features was a 24-pounder main gun deck. Well, as far as the Swedish ships are concerned, they're like, oh, that's our upper gun deck. Here's our lower gun deck. It's even nastier. So essentially, you've got a ship that is armed actually somewhat heavier than some of the 74-gun Razes, which just had the 32-pounder main gun deck. And we know that the American ships, when they saw the 32-pounder Razes, like the Magnanime, just went, nah, we're not fighting that. So this ship has even more guns and even heavier broadside. So at that point, Constitution will probably be best advised to go, yeah, all right, we get the message. We're just going to sail off with our superior speed and just hope that the storm doesn't blow up. Because, of course, in heavy weather, on average, a ship of the line, especially one that's reasonably quick, already will tend to overhaul a frigate because their greater weight of sail and heavier hull tends to drive through rougher seas somewhat more efficiently than a frigate, which tends to bounce around a little bit. Explicitly Implicit asks, what was the Japanese reaction to the death of Admiral Yamamoto? By all accounts, it seems that it was quite a morale impact for both the Japanese people as a whole and the Japanese Navy in particular, to the extent that the fact that he'd actually died was actually kept away from the general populace for around about 4 to 5 weeks while they tried to figure out, A, who's going to be in charge next, and B, how to spin this as positively as you could, which obviously there's very limited options in that particular field. But you've got to remember that obviously Yamamoto, thanks to propaganda in part, and also thanks to be honest, his skills, had kind of become a little bit of a larger-than-life figure in both the terms of the Japanese populace and the Japanese Navy. He'd been the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, which at that point was still seen as a very successful thing. He had masterminded Japan's general expansion across the Pacific. And bearing in mind at this point that the scale of the loss at Midway was still being quite heavily concealed. So as far as most people were concerned within the Greater Japanese Empire, Yamamoto had taken Japan from starting, crippled the US Pacific Fleet, and expanded Japan's control over most of the Western Pacific, dealing blows to basically every Allied colonial power in the area, kicking back various counteroffensives, driving the Royal Navy from the eastern part of the Indian Ocean, although that was Nagumo's offensive, but Yamamoto was the overall commander of the fleet, so he kind of gets credit, at least in the public view. And yeah, of course, you had Coral Sea and stuff, but the general view was a few reverses, which you will get in war, but right at the periphery of our massively suddenly expanded empire, which is all down to the great wisdom of Admiral Yamamoto, and then all of a sudden, he's dead. So, yeah, that didn't sit well with a lot of people, to say the least. Richard Sue asks, are the shells typically on display in museum ships good to be fired? I understand they're probably inert, but theoretically, if push came to shove and you wanted to poke holes in an enemy ship, would these shells do the job? I mean, it depends how intact they are and how much they've been taken care of since they went out of active service. Obviously, this one in the Broadway corridor of USS New Jersey is a plastic inert example, but various museum ships do have, well, they're not replicas, they're full-size deactivated shells. At least one hopes they're deactivated shells. There have been instances, I'm not aware of museum ships, but certainly in other places where supposedly deactivated battleship shells have been standing around for ages, and then it's turned out they weren't quite so deactivated, but never mind. So, if their driving bands are still in place, and if they haven't been left out in the rain and allowed to rust away and patched up with paint and so forth, so if they've been stored in, arsenals and armories and so forth, and then someone's gone, oh, well, the ship's being deactivated, we'll just, take the explosive bits out and return it to the ship for use, then, yeah, theoretically, you could load the thing up into a gun and fire it. Now, it won't land anywhere close to where you're aiming because, well, you've if you've deactivated it, you've taken out the charge, so its weight is going to be completely off and its balance is going to be completely off. And I suspect that probably the methods by which they've actually removed the explosive charge, I think, apart from anything, you've now got a hollow space where before there was explosive, so you may have issues with overall structural strength. But assuming that maybe you don't have too many issues with the structural strength, maybe it's been plugged properly or whatever, and it survives the initial acceleration, then yeah, a well-kept inert shell would just be a flying lump of metal with an awful lot of kinetic energy behind it. But as I said, in and of themselves, those inert shells are not going to go where you want them to go because they're going to have a very different flight characteristic or profile. Depending on exactly how they've been deactivated, I suppose in theory, you could, I suppose, either fill them back up with some kind of explosive, certainly the American battleships, because, well, you can buy explosives in America, or at least some form of inert powder or something that brings them back into correct balance, and then they might actually go where you want them to. Getting the reason why I say you might want to use just inert powder is because getting explosive to pour into the shell is one thing. It's not out of the question in the US, but getting hold of the correct fuses, that's another matter entirely. Kirsendarken asks, in the Age of Sail, what were the 3 ships whose captures were the most impactful? Not in terms of the careers they'd go on to have in their new navies, but in terms of the broader impact of the information, cargo, technology, persons, or other prizes found on board. Oh, that's an interesting one. I think certainly one of them would have to be the capture of the Cacafuego by the Golden Hind. Now, in and of itself, you might think, oh, it's just a bunch of gold and jewels and stuff and makes Francis Drake a very rich person. Yes, this is true. However, bear in mind that when he gets back, the amount of money that he's brought back as returned to various investors, including the Queen, is enough to settle the kingdom's national debt. That's quite a lot. And factor in, obviously, Henry VIII, and then, well, okay, very briefly, Edward, and then Mary I. They'd not exactly left England in the best of financial situations, so that was quite a large amount of debt to clear. Now, why is this important? Well, of course, clearing the national debt meant that Elizabeth was in a position not only to fund some more ships for the Royal Navy, but also to, at least to a certain degree, pay for bringing other ships into the Navy when, the Spanish Armada showed up. Now, obviously, her courtiers and stuff did their level best not to pay those people, but if you had a situation where the Armada was showing up and England was still rolling in the national debt that it had incurred up until Drake's return with the Golden Hind, I have a feeling, A, there might have been a little bit more tension within the kingdom as a whole anyway, and B, I think Elizabeth might have had a bit more trouble persuading people that she could actually pay if they rocked up with their ships to help defend the country. Another fairly significant ship capture would be the capture of the French Invincible in the late 1740s, because the French had been running 74 gunners for almost 2 decades at that point, maybe between a decade or two. But the British were still running with 50 gunners, 54 gunners, 60 gunners, etc., etc. But then when the Invincible was captured, then the British took her into service and went, 74 guns, you say? It seems like a good idea. And then, well, very quickly, the 74 gunner became the default British third rate, which was a situation that lasted pretty much until the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Which, well, considering the capabilities and how much the 74 gunners got done, I bet you the French were regretting losing that particular one. And for a third example, I'm going to award a joint prize to a number of different Spanish treasure fleets and ships, because throughout particularly the 1700s, there were a number of instances where Spanish participation in a major war was either very badly dented, or in some cases Spain was forced to seek terms, purely because their treasure fleet or treasure galleon sailing from South America ended up getting ambushed either by a ship, a squadron, or a small fleet of ships, and destroyed or captured, and, well, cutting off the single largest source of income for an empire for that year. Yeah, that tended to do bad things to the Spanish economy and force them to seek a peace that, if they had received that year's funding, they probably wouldn't have done. The Past is Another Country asks, what was the biggest material deficiency of the major navies going into World War II? So what ships, technology, airplanes, etc. did they just not have or not have enough of? Okay, so for the Royal Navy, I'm going to say destroyers, but more broadly escorts. But if you have to pin it down to any one particular ship type, the Royal Navy desperately needed more destroyers going into World War II. Simply because, well, there were so many different demands. Convoy escorts, warship escorts, actually acting on their own as flotillas, and so on and so forth. And they took some fairly hefty losses in the opening part of the war as well. If the Royal Navy had had more destroyers available to escort various things, then you could perhaps hypothesize that HMS Courageous wouldn't be lost, because, well, with more destroyers, you might have a stronger screen against the U-boats. Saving an entire fleet carrier, okay, not the world's most capable fleet carrier, but a fleet carrier still, that early on in the war, has huge knock-on effects for what Britain can and can't do as Italy enters the war, and so on and so forth. Likewise, if you have more destroyers, then perhaps you can afford more than 2 to escort Glorious, and that might save Glorious from, well, her captain's own stupidity, as it would seem. I mean, you might still lose quite a few of them, but 4 or 6 destroyers bearing down on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau might force them to think a little bit harder about what to shoot at, as opposed to just 2. And then, of course, for anti-submarine escorts, again, for convoys and stuff, obviously every merchant ship that survives, where historically they don't, is another cargo load delivered to the UK early on in the war, which can have some very big knock-on effects further down the line. And, of course, each cargo ship that survives may potentially survive one or more additional runs, which obviously then snowballs the Allied cargo fleet somewhat sooner than historically speaking. For the US, I'm actually going to go with radar, believe it or not, because they do have radar, obviously, but I think at the time that they enter World War II, they're in a very awkward spot in that they've got some ships that don't have radar, some ships that do have radar, but it's relatively limited early generation radar with limited range, limited arcs of scan and so forth, and other ships which have the latest and greatest radar for the period, like SG radar, for example. And I think that leaves the US Navy, certainly in early 1942, in a bit of a weird position, in that it's a new enough technology that not everybody who's in positions of command actually understands or trusts it, which is a bit of a downside, as we'll see in several engagements. But on top of that, even if you do understand radar and you want it, you might not have it on the ship that you want to use, or it might not be the most capable set, and there'll be other ships in the fleet that are more capable, but then obviously leads to all sorts of confusion, and again, misunderstanding about just how good it is can lead to things like First Savo Island, where, yes, technically you have a radar-equipped ship on patrol, but you perhaps don't understand that it has blind spots, and other ships that could overlap their radars don't have them, or don't have as wider ranging radar, and so on and so forth. Obviously, it's a situation that does get rectified as the war goes on, but I think that is actually a fairly major problem for the US fleet early on, where you've got just enough of something to think you have an advantage, but maybe actually not quite enough to exploit it properly. For the Italians, probably an aircraft carrier. Much as the Mediterranean is a closed environment, or mostly closed environment, the coordination or issues with coordination with the Regia Aeronautica did have some fairly significant knock-on impacts for the Regia Marina, and even having a relatively basic carrier, even something that could only operate 2-3 dozen aircraft, so the equivalent of a light fleet carrier rather than a full-size carrier, especially if it was primarily loaded with fighters, probably would have helped the Italians quite a bit, because some of the incidents that they had out at sea when they were attacked by relatively small numbers of British aircraft that could have been seen off by a relatively small fighter contingent could have obviously vastly helped them. And also bearing in mind that the British were concealing their use of signals intelligence quite a bit by sending in recon aircraft to, oh no, look, we spotted the Italians. Clearly we have a reason to act. Um, if the major Italian fleet deployments are covered by even a small to medium carrier that's constantly got a combat air patrol up, that makes that whole exercise a lot more risky and makes it, sometimes if those aircraft are driven off or shot down, a lot more difficult to justify why exactly are the British showing up all the time where the Italian fleet's planning to be, which might, make the Italians twig a little bit earlier that maybe some of these signal encryption things aren't actually working as well as we think. For the Germans, well, you could list off everything, but large numbers of decent destroyers that aren't trying to flip themselves upside down would probably be the single largest thing, because that really, really hampers their ability to operate generally, and especially once Narvik and the Norwegian campaign is done. And for the Japanese, without cheaping out and saying ships in general, I mean, do you count pilots as a material? Because, yeah, they really needed a much bigger pool of carrier pilots. There's a fair amount they could potentially have done, even with Midway going the way that it did, if they'd had a bigger pool of trained pilots. Not that they wouldn't have won the war, but they certainly could have made it last a lot longer. Whereas, yeah, once you start losing significant numbers of trained pilots, it becomes much, much harder to pull things back. Reichspear Minister asks, could you talk about main gun designs with magazines somewhat like handheld guns, i.e. drum mags, box mags, tube mags, and so on, equipped on warships in the last 60 to 70 years that the channel covers? What are or were popular ideas, and what are the pros, cons, and perhaps why they ultimately failed? For main gun designs, they basically don't exist. There are magazine-fed lighter cannons, like this Hotchkiss cannon, which are very prevalent in the late 19th century for anti-torpedo boat work. So there's still a ship gun as opposed to an anti-aircraft gun. But that's really about as far as it goes. Because if we're talking about main gun designs, unfortunately, it just doesn't work on many, many levels on a warship scale. For one thing, the sheer weight of these things would be quite a lot, and that's a lot of weight to store up high in the ship. It also means that things like, say, with a tubular magazine, like you have on a Winchester or something, where you're relying somewhat on spring pressure, the amount of spring pressure you'd need to start shoving around battleship-sized shells and their charges, no. Box mags using gravity, again, friction would be far too high. Plus, of course, remember all of these things are using charge bags rather than cartridges. Even the Krupp guns only use the brass cartridge as the last stage rather than everything else. So the logistics of getting it all to work is just not gonna happen. Drum mags, theoretically, because you preloaded everything all in a sequence, could have a little bit more viability, but then if you've ever seen the shell and power and chargeback train for any significant sized naval gun of, well, in the 60, 70 years the channel covers at the end, so the 1880s onwards, that will be one heck of a long revolver cylinder. And not apart from the weight and the space that would take up in the turret, you'd also have other issues around potentially overheating the gun if you're firing that quickly, and the fact that that's an awful lot of explosive to be storing in the turret at any one time, and people tended to appreciate that would be a problem. Plus, can you imagine the size of the gun pit you'd need if you had a 12-inch gun with, I don't know, a 6-shot revolver cylinder mounted on top of it, and far too many parts that could break and so on and so forth. So while various magazine-fed ideas were present for smaller guns, like, I say, this anti-torpedo boat gun and perhaps slightly large guns than that, if you're looking at the main gun designs, the big hefty stuff, it's just not happening in that time period. Captain Verfluiding asks, Were there ever any designs for rockets or bombs that used white phosphorus for smoke screens or for suppressing anti-aircraft guns? I imagine a cloud of noxious fumes rolling across the deck wouldn't do a good thing to an open anti-aircraft gun mount. Weirdly enough, there were an awful lot of uses for white phosphorus on land and in naval vessels firing at targets on land, and a little bit of use of white phosphorus, among other things, in various experiments with smoke screens to conceal ships. But in terms of directly attacking the enemy, no. Um, Simply because, kind of similar to using the poison gas that we mentioned earlier in this dry dock, the fact is, if you're able to land a hit on an enemy with a bomb, honestly, you're just better off packing it full of explosive because, yeah, white phosphorus will be dangerous and debilitating for people nearby when it lands and goes off. But you know what else will be dangerous and debilitating for people nearby when a bomb goes off? A massive amount of explosive and metal shrapnel. Plus, the massive amount of explosive and metal shrapnel might actually do damage to the ship. Whereas white phosphorus on a battleship or a warship in general is mostly just going to sit there and burn. So someone, a deck or two down when a white phosphorus bomb goes off, is like, oh, I wonder what's going on up there. Someone a deck or two down, if you drop a 500-pound explosive bomb, well, they may not be wondering anything because they may very well be dead, and even if they're still alive, there's going to be a socking great hole in the ship. Now, of course, that doesn't mean there wasn't naval use of white phosphorus against other ships, but it tended to be incidental because white phosphorus was used in things like, say, for example, star shells, and there are instances where ships were either running low on ammo or got caught out with the wrong ammo loaded, of just flinging anything and everything at targeted ships and plastering them with a bunch of star shell or illumination shell, and thus you did end up with a bunch of white phosphorus burning on the exterior of various targeted vessels. But that wasn't intentional, and I can absolutely assure you the people who were firing those shells would have greatly preferred to have more explosive or armor-piercing shells to hand. Paul from Chicago asks, third-class protected cruisers are largely regarded by naval historians as pointless vessels. I'd agree, actually. And the scrapping of them was a good day's work. But from a capability standpoint, the third-class cruiser looks a lot like the Acacia class of World War I. Coastal convoy work or minesweeping, valuable stuff that gets taken for granted. Yes, the third-class cruiser is a little bigger than a Flower-class sloop, but that just means more depth charges. Indeed, the third-class cruiser seems more valuable than the larger protected or armoured cruisers prior to the Devonshires, which are all basically too large, but ironically with too low a freeboard, to do anything much valuable outside of fire support in the calm waters of the Mediterranean, and, well, also being U-boat magnets. So were the third-class cruisers scrapped too soon compared to their larger brethren, and does being small create unrecognised value? My main problem with the third-class cruisers, and I think most historians' problem with them, is that they don't really offer all that much capability, but they do absorb quite a lot of resources. Because, well, if you compare them to an Acacia class, now, yes, in theory, a third-class cruiser, like this is Pyramus of the Perlus class, in theory, this might make a slightly better convoy escort. It's a little bit faster than an Acacia class, and, yeah, you could put more depth charges and stuff on it. However, a Perlus class third-class cruiser takes about 3 to 4 times the crew of an Acacia class to actually run. So, just in terms of manpower, you could be running multiple sloops for the price of running a single Perlus. And the other problem is they're just horrendously badly armed. They've only got 4-inch guns. Now, granted, some German ships only have 4.1-inch guns, but that's not saying a huge amount positive about them either. Because with these dinky little 4-inch guns, what you have is a slow vessel, not a huge amount of protection, although some third-class cruisers do at least have a protected deck, and lightweight, short-range armament, which means that if you do put them on convoy escort work, okay, they're expensive both in manpower and cost way of potentially guarding against submarines, but they offer virtually no protection against incoming surface raiders. Even something like Emden, which is, well, one of those ships with 4.1-inch guns, A, she has more of them, and B, she's faster and somewhat better protected, which means she can choose the engagement with one of these things, and one of these things can't decline it. And if you are up against anything with any more substantial armament, then you're really in trouble. And I mean, one of the Perlas class, actually, the Pegasus, ended up facing off against a ship that's not massively more capable than Emden, the Königsberg, which still had only 4.1-inch guns, but the Königsberg's armament was longer range as well as being heavier, plus the ship being faster as well. And she was able to completely dominate the Pegasus. So even a relatively small 4.1-inch armed German cruiser can overwhelm these things. Heck, at that point, I'd even give decent money on some of the bigger German armed merchant cruisers, because those things tended to have 5.9-inch guns. Yeah, sure, they've obviously got virtually no protection and so forth, but a big converted German liner is probably going to outrange and definitely outspeed a Perlas. Now, I will grant you that in a pinch, if you were to strip them of most of their armament, maybe you don't keep 3 or 4 of the 4-inch guns, get rid of the rest, get rid of the torpedo tubes, etc., you might be able to bring their overall manpower requirement down somewhat. Then obviously stick on not torpedoes, depth charges, and so forth, and you might have a okay-ish convoy escort or convoy escort command vessel with a reasonable manpower requirement and so forth. And that might stand you in good stead in a pinch when you really, really need convoy escort ships, but you're turning what essentially should be a small warship into something that is only just about viable as a stopgap convoy escort, which, that's not really brilliant. So yeah, you could potentially put them to other uses, but that's more just to do with the fact that they're an available hull that doesn't really have any other practical use, certainly not their intended original use, outside of being repurposed for very much second-line duties. And I mean, if you want a small, poorly protected, relatively poorly armed cruiser to go tooling around with potential secondary uses elsewhere, much as they also weren't particularly brilliant, I would probably go with actually scout cruisers instead, certainly in a Royal Navy context, because their crewing requirements aren't all that much divorced from a third-class cruiser. And yes, they have hilariously anemic armaments, at least up until you get to the Arethusa class, which is considerably past the Perlas, to be fair. And as I said, they're not particularly well protected either, but at least they've got speed. So they can get out of dodge when, well, anything substantial comes calling. Whereas the poor old third class, they can't. Colin Olsen asks, around 6 years or so ago, I asked you what would happen if the Allies had given the Polish an R-class battleship in your Free Navies of World War II video. In keeping with that theme, what if Poland had been allowed to keep SMS Baden as a form of reparations from Germany to form a core for the Polish Navy to build around a reasonable force against the growing Soviet threat? Would she go into service as is after they'd pumped her out of water at Scapa and repaired the damage, or would she be updated in the early 1920s, in your opinion? If she was then further modernised around the same time the Queen Elizabeths were, what would that modernisation look like, and who would be the most likely to carry it out? And finally, would her existence give the Germans any pause in their plans to invade the country in 1939, and what would her war service look like? He also says, please assume that Poland can actually afford all of this. Okay, so that removes the single biggest obstacle, which is, frankly, Poland wouldn't be able to afford all of this. But if we assume that either Poland can afford all of this magically, or perhaps part of the reparation deal is that not only do they get Baden, but Germany has to continue paying for her operations. Now, given that she's a mixed-firing vessel in World War One, when she gets pulled up and out of Scapa, that's probably not something that the Poles would want to keep as a feature. I mean, there's nothing particularly wrong with her main armament, secondary armament, fire control, etc., in and of itself, but, well, she's going to need a bit of a refit after being drained anyway, so they might as well refit her for pure oil firing. Also, considering they're probably not going to need her to go particularly long distances either, uh, I don't think they completely refit her fuel tanks to do other things, but as aviation comes into play, they may perhaps look at, say, repurposing a fuel tank or two to hold aviation fuel so that they can have some kind of scout aircraft on board. Now, as you go further in to the interwar period, so she's basically got a little bit of a spruce up in the early 20s, when that'll probably be about it. But if she's then modernized around the same time as the Queen Elizabeth, so the late 1930s, then I think it's going to be a rather interesting question of who does it, because I think from the Polish perspective, given that they're ordering ships and so forth from the British, it would make more sense in theory to send them over to the British, but I think it would then become a question of how much yard space is available in British yards to conduct the upgrade. Now, to be fair, there was a little bit of slack capacity in the British yards overall because, of course, there were financial constraints limiting how many ships the Royal Navy could send in and various other issues. So it's possible that she might get an overhaul in a British yard. Otherwise, possibly send us to the States. They're always going to have plenty of yard space. But if she was going to get such a refit, I don't think you'd see a full-on Queen Elizabeth Valiant style refit. I think it would probably be maybe more a Royal Oak or Royal Oak on steroids style refit. So modern fire control, probably a little bit too early to give her radar. And also, she's a third-party vessel. Pull some of the secondary battery and install maybe twin 4-inch or if she goes to the States, 5-inch 25s as an anti-aircraft battery, maybe a smattering of light or medium anti-aircraft guns as well. And that, and maybe a bow reshaping, would probably call it a day. Depending on how much steaming she's done, she might go in for a bit deeper refit and get some updated machinery, which would be good, but only if it's necessary. Now, would her existence give the Germans any pause in their plans to invade the country? Maybe. I mean, it certainly would be a very major consideration. I don't think it would stop them in any way, shape, or form, but they'd probably either want to target her with a lot of aircraft very early on, kind of similar to how the Soviet battleships were targeted during Operation Barbarossa, or, depending on where she's moored, given that the Germans obviously opened the war by sending in their modernised pre-dreadnoughts and doing shore bombardment, those modernised pre-dreadnoughts could use torpedoes on her, for example, if the Poles make the big mistake of letting the German ships more within line of sight of their ex-Baden and not having any anti-torpedo nets out. Of course, if you have the now Polish battleship in a protected anchorage somewhere near the Westerplatte, that could give the Germans some pause for their specific operation in that area. So I suspect it will be probably air power that they direct against it. Now, assuming that she survives the airstrikes, which she might not, but assuming that she did, and she made hightail for the UK, then I think she'd probably slot in probably somewhere around about the same level as Barham and Malaya, because if she's had a Royal Oak on steroids refit, she'd be somewhat, and properly maintained, she'd be a somewhat more capable and somewhat better platform than the majority of the R class, who haven't had quite that extensive a refit and obviously have been a lot more hard used, but she's not quite to the level of Warspite, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant. So yeah, she'd probably have a similar role to Barham and Malaya, so probably being assigned to convoy escort work, maybe the Mediterranean theatre for a bit, and, well, who knows what's going to happen to her during all of that. Duke Master asks, as the Second World War progressed, ships began to gain improbable amounts of anti-aircraft weaponry to the point of running out of room or even becoming top-heavy and needing to take something else off. How did they decide how much weaponry to add and where to put it? Was it systematic or random? Or was it just a case of adding more until they ran out of room? It was a bit of a mixture. In the sort of mid-part of the war, when everyone's scrambling to get as much AA weaponry as humanly possible, there is a bit of a random nature. You know, ships showing up and captains going, right, what in the terms of light and medium anti-aircraft guns are around, and where can I put them, and can I Shanghai them from the docks? It's a little bit more official than that, but not by much. At the same time, back at home, you do have various ship design departments. They who know, ships are coming back into homeland docks, obviously for the US, possibly Pearl Harbor, certainly when they're coming back to the continental US. For the British, obviously, that's mostly coming back to the UK. And they're analysing, what's worked, what hasn't worked, what have we got in stock, what can we refit, because I've got the plans for the various ships, what's needed elsewhere for that matter. Because sometimes, certainly with British ships, they would look at things and go, look, okay, realistically, we want to put the number of pom-poms on some of the capital ships up, but we don't have as many as we'd like. But these smaller ships, cruisers, destroyers, perhaps have pom-poms, and we can take them from them, but then obviously they'll be lacking in AA, but then we've also got these 20 mils. Now, the 20 millimeter Orlican is great, but it's also available in very large quantities comparatively. So while they will put some on the capital ships, what you'll end up with is smaller ships perhaps sacrificing some of their pom-pom mounts, usually quads, and having them replaced with larger numbers of 20 millimeter Orlicans, and then those pom-poms being moved to the higher priority vessels, as well as those vessels getting the 20 mils. And then, of course, as the Bofors comes in, there's even further rearrangement. And again, it depends on the theatre, but generally speaking, when they're looking at upgrading the anti-aircraft armament, they're having to look at things like fields of fire. Where can they get ammunition from? Do they have storage for the ammunition? How much crew is this going to add? What are the arcs of fire at different positions? If you, for example, if you wanted to put on, say, a couple of twin 40mm Bofors, there might not be space as it stands, but if you remove an existing twin 40mm, then that might free up space to put two twin 40mm. And that might be a good idea if that's a centerline mount and you're replacing it with two wing mounts, if the ship is expected to be in a scenario where they're going to be engaging air attacks from multiple sides at once. Whereas if you're in a position where perhaps you're thinking that the air attacks are going to come in, but they're going to be fairly focused and coming in from one direction, then it might be better instead to replace, if you've got the weight, to replace that centerline twin with a centerline quad. So you can only engage down one vector, but with more firepower. And then as you start to run out of weight and space, you have to start making judgment calls as to what can you afford to lose. So in some cases, with destroyers that have multiple sets of torpedo launchers, if it's getting towards the end of the Pacific War, and let's face it, there just aren't that many major Japanese warships out there anymore, okay, maybe you don't need the torpedo launchers quite as much, so you can afford to ditch one in exchange for more anti-aircraft guns. Conversely, if you're a cruiser like HMS Norfolk here, they might decide, well, actually, there are still a few Japanese cruisers out there, so maybe retaining the torpedo launchers here might be a good idea. But honestly, given the sheer preponderance of numbers of Allied cruisers and the increasing number of kamikazes, maybe we don't need quite as many heavy guns. And as you can see with Norfolk, they made the decision to take off X-turret, the super-firing 8-inch aft, and replace it with more anti-aircraft weaponry there. So different considerations factor in at different times. And then, of course, as the air threat gets heavier and aircraft get more durable and they start launching weapons from further away, then you have to start making essentially balancing arguments of, do we get rid of half a dozen 20mm Orlicans so that we can fit another twin Bofors, or do we get rid of half a dozen Orlicans and a twin Bofors to fit a quad pom-pom or something like that? Essentially trading off barrel count for range and hitting power per shell. All of these things have to be taken into account. That's why you see this sort of almost endless reconfiguring of anti-aircraft guns on anything really big enough to carry them. Lord Druken asks, in the video HMS Venturer versus U-864, you mentioned that this was the only confirmed battle between submarines that occurred below the surface at the time. How common were sub versus sub fights during the World Wars, and were such battles more common in the Atlantic or the Pacific during World War II? While they weren't common, Sub versus sub engagements were also not particularly unheard of during either war. And that's a combination of really two major factors. One, submarines tend to operate obviously stealthily very close to enemy coasts. So if there's anything that's going to spot another stealthy platform proceeding on the surface, then it's probably going to be another submarine. And secondly, especially when it came to the Allies, use of intelligence to hunt and destroy enemy subs was often used by giving that information to friendly submarines. Again, partly because, well, they stood the best chance of getting close to the enemy coast where you might find a transiting submarine. Also, they're the least likely to be spotted. Aircraft could be spotted and you could crash dive from them. A submarine, if it did its job, wouldn't be noticed until the torpedoes were incoming. Also, in terms of being able to counteract, obviously a submarine could have anti-aircraft guns to shoot at aircraft. It's got torpedoes. It can, if a destroyer or its other escort shows up, it can fire torpedoes at them. Whereas another sub, if it's operating at periscope depth, it looses a bunch of torpedoes. The enemy sub at best is going to have to be concentrating on dodging first, and by the time it resolves that it's not going to get hit and brings its own torpedoes to bear, if the hunting sub has ducked fully under the water, there's literally nothing that other sub can do because they don't know where it is and they don't have depth charges. So oddly enough, submarines make really, really good submarine hunters. And that's outside of obviously chance encounters and so forth. So you do have instances on both sides where submarines come across, submarines that are submerged come across enemy submarines that are surfaced, and they'll engage them with torpedoes, and sometimes it goes well, and sometimes it doesn't go so well. There's even a few engagements where two submarines on the surface run into each other and end up in deck gun fights, as well as firing torpedoes at each other. And there's occasionally cat and mouse games. Like there's one cat and mouse game where I believe it's one of the Dutch subs near the Strait of Gibraltar is being hunted by a U-boat, and they kind of know the U-boat is there, but they're trying not to give it away so that they can bring their own torpedo tubes to bear. But then the U-boat fires torpedoes and it all gets very hectic. I would say on balance, sub v sub engagements were a little bit more common in World War II in the Atlantic and surrounding areas, purely because of the fact that you did actually legitimately have Allied subs sitting outside various German-held ports trying to hunt the U-boats. And plus being sent out by Intel to go and hunt U-boats, which obviously is how U-864 and HMS Ventura ended up meeting up. Plus, of course, the confined waters of the North Sea and so forth lend themselves to things. You see subs hunting subs in World War I at the Northern Barrage as well, for that matter. Whereas out in the Pacific, not only the paths of Imperial Japanese and US Navy subs less likely to cross, but there's just fewer Imperial Japanese Navy subs, period. Statistically speaking, you're much more likely to run into a U-boat than a Japanese submarine, just based on sheer numbers. Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harikaze asks, I recently read that RO 500, the former U 511, joined some sort of naval rebellion after the Japanese surrender and sailed out in order to conduct attacks on the Soviets, and had to have a number of radio messages and a float plane find them before they agreed to turn around. What was going on there with the crew? Was it a case of not believing the surrender was real, or did they just want to go out fighting? So what seems to have happened is a kind of small-scale mutiny at the Maizuru naval base, because according to at least to Japanese sources, what seems to have happened is a whole bunch of Navy personnel there, and bear in mind at this point the subs that were there were mostly being used for training, so perhaps there was a degree of, with them not being on the front lines, maybe either they felt they had something to prove, or because they weren't on the front lines, maybe they didn't realize just how bad it was. But either way, they seem to have gotten it into their heads that just surrendering was really not on. And again, according to the Japanese sources, RO 500, I 201, and I 202 all headed out, and particularly RO 500 is supposed to have sailed out with a marking on its conning tower that basically meant that they were going out to their deaths. They didn't expect to come back. But at some point during their transit off to go and attack the Soviets, who presumably were the nearest targets, as you mentioned, the the base via radio messages, and a float plane managed to persuade them. Actually, no, obeying the Emperor when he says stop is better than throwing your lives away for something that you've been told is pointless anyway. And so they turned back, and essentially everyone kind of agreed to not mention it going forward. Primark 359 asks, several typhoons had significant deleterious impacts on fleets in the Pacific both before and during World War II. However, while we were watching your Great White Fleet video, the fleet survived without any significant damage. Were the pre-dreadnoughts of the Great White Fleet better able to survive these storms because one or more design differences, or was it a weaker storm than those that damaged the more modern fleets? It certainly wasn't a particularly weaker storm. Ironically enough, both the Great White Fleet storm and the Pacific storms that Halsey ran into both involved the USS New Jersey, just different ones. This is the Great White Fleet edition, USS New Jersey BB-16. As you can see, doing her very best to cosplay as a submarine in the middle of the typhoon, or one of the typhoons that hit the Great White Fleet. Now, yeah, as you can see, that's a fairly substantial sea to run into. However, you have to remember a few things. One, the ships that were the worst affected by the typhoons in World War II, and for that matter, when you get things like the Fourth Fleet incident, tend to be the more lightly built ships, destroyers and aircraft carriers that have lightweight, smashable stuff, which, yeah, that's a problem both in terms of structural damage and also when you've got destroyers riding light on fuel, they get knocked over more easily. Whereas pre-dreadnoughts, they tend to have a relatively stubby length-to-beam ratio, especially relative to destroyers and carriers, which makes them a little bit more stable. Plus, of course, they're not riding high, low on fuel. They can just button up and everyone go below. They're pretty solid, obviously heavily armoured and so forth, and they just kind of chug along. And of course, the other advantage is because they're not in wartime, they're not obligated to strictly stick to any kind of station keeping or position keeping because of potential attack during or after the storm by the enemy. Now, of course, you don't want to just all go off independently because that way collision lies, but they do have a little bit more freedom of action to fight the storm directly as opposed to ships in wartime, which have a lot of other considerations to play with. So essentially, compared to the destroyers and carriers that really don't do particularly well in the World War II typhoons, or the destroyers and cruisers that don't do too well in the Fourth Fleet incident, these pre-dreadnoughts are much more stable just because of their nature and much more able to react to the storms. And so they basically just carry on through without too much in the way of concerns, apart from, as I covered in the video, one guy being swept off one ship and fetching up on another one. Kern von Kröning asks, were exceptionally large destroyers ever called cruisers, either by their own navy or by other navies? There's two sides to this coin. Actually, ironically enough, both mostly centered in the Mediterranean. So, on the one hand, you have the Italian Capitani Romani class, which the Italians just about refer to as cruisers. Very small cruisers, but cruisers nonetheless. However, interestingly enough, as I covered in my very last destroyer development video, in the post-war environment, as destroyer sizes had started growing larger, the Italians actually re-gunned a couple of Capitani Romanis and relabeled them to being destroyers. So they just crossed the line from being a very small cruiser to a very large destroyer, although, as I said, mostly, I think, because of the inflation of destroyer sizes more than anything else. The flip side to this is the Marine Nationale ships, hence why we've got Mogador here. So, obviously, the French have the torpilleurs, the contre-torpilleurs, the big ones, like Mogador here, and obviously, if a navy builds a very big destroyer, but they say it's a destroyer, they're going to keep calling it a destroyer because that's what they decided. However, in US Navy terms, certainly by the time of the Battle of Casablanca, the US Navy had decided, having seen some of the Free French super destroyers, that these ships were actually very small cruisers. So you actually have the US Navy calling the biggest of the French super destroyers as light cruisers. So you actually get both sides of that equation in the Med. Matt Osborne asks, please tell us the sad, sad story of the Lend-Lease ship Empire Starlight in 1942. Well, I hope I've got the right one, because there were, weirdly enough, a disturbingly large number of ships called either Empire Star or Empire Starlight that all met pretty horrible fates in 1942, believe it or not. But the one that I think you're asking about is one that went off on the Arctic convoy run. So made it through the gauntlet of U-boats and the Luftwaffe and everything, made it all the way to Russian ports. Fantastic. Starts offloading cargo. The Luftwaffe appear. Oh dear. Well, she's actually fairly heavily armed for a merchant ship at this stage, so returns fire, shoots down a German bomber, takes a bomb hit to her cargo hold, but the cargo hold is full of cargo, so it mostly damps the explosion. Okay, that wasn't brilliant, but whatever. Keep offloading the cargo. Cargo is now offloaded. More air raids. Okay, this isn't good. Damage from some of the bomb hits, so they decide, right, we're going to move off to an anchorage that's a little bit away from the main port, because theoretically the bombers should be targeting the port rather than an empty ship. So they start patching her up. Great, now we can go home. Oh no, wait, there's a return cargo to pick up. So she goes back to the docks to pick up cargo, and what you know is bombed again. And again. And again. And again and again and again. And again and again and again. And she seems to live a bit of a charmed life, because she has ridiculous amounts of ordnance thrown at her. The Luftwaffe seems to have picked her out for some kind of special treatment for some bizarre reason, given that she is, just a cargo ship. But she does take a couple more hits, plenty of near misses, lots and lots of damage accumulating. They try moving her around, they try patching up, but no, it just seems the Luftwaffe is absolutely determined they're going to have this ship no matter what. And eventually the cumulative damage, although the ship's crew are still fighting back quite well, and they've actually taken out multiple German bombers at this stage. And I mean, given the cost benefit of just how many bombs they've chucked at this ship and how many valuable bombers they've lost to this ship, whatever happens to her at this point, Empire Starlight is coming out ahead in the equation. But she's so Civ-like at this point that one of the officials on shore basically says, yeah, we don't trust her to stay afloat anymore. The crew is still willing to fight for her, but they get brought ashore. And when she's sitting relatively abandoned, she gets hit by another load of bombs, and that finally sends her to the bottom. Although, of course, because she's in a shallow water harbour, it means she settles a few feet and just kind of sits there looking a bit forlorn, having taken the Luftwaffe an unearthly amount of ordnance and 8 weeks of almost continuous bombing to put her down. Cody774 asks, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the Tiger Congo style aft turret layout with a large space between the two turrets compared to the more standard super firing arrangement? There are really only 3 advantages to this kind of layout. Firstly, it's better than what came before it. So when you look at the Lion class, for instance, where you have super firing turrets forward, then you have an amidships turret and an aft turret. Compared to that, the Tiger-Congo layout, where you have these spaced turrets aft, well, at least now both are of your turrets that aren't forward have fairly wide firing arcs. So that's a plus. Better firing arcs than with the Q turret, which obviously can't fire aft. And with that much space, you can also actually have some pretty nice forward firing arcs with those guns. So that's a small plus. Second plus is, well, as you can see, these guns are very widely spaced out. So a hit on one is pretty much, unless it's going to catastrophically destroy the ship anyway, not going to knock out the other one. There is always that risk with super firing turrets of some shots that might disable one turret might also therefore be able to disable the other, especially if fire is able to spread between barbettes, as happened with Seydlitz. So, there's that. The aft turrets are pretty much little independent domains. And then the final theoretical benefit is, well, think about where the ship's engines are going to go. Look at detailed plans for Tiger or Congo, and you'll see, obviously, you can see where the boilers are, that's where the funnels are. But whereas on most ships of the period, you would have the boilers and then the engines and then the guns, in this case, you have the boilers and then the higher mounted, it's not even really superfiring, turret, and then the engines are in between the two turrets, and then obviously the final turret. So why is that a plus? Well, in theory, it does mean that if you take hits from torpedoes or mines or that kind of stuff underwater, your propeller shafts are going to be ever so slightly shorter than they would be otherwise, which means your propulsion system is a little bit more durable. So unintentionally, not necessarily mimicking because they predate, but unintentionally similar to the design considerations that were deliberately put in place for HMS Belfast and Edinburgh. A little bit more durability on your prop shafts. The negatives are, well, the the magazine for your, let's say, X turret is right next to your boiler room. You're going to have fun keeping that cool. You've also got a relatively heavy turret right aft, so that's going to cause some interesting stresses and strains to your ship. And as you can see, the hull is narrowing down quite considerably, so you might have some fun trying to fully protect that magazine and barbette setup. Although, to be fair, you'd only get a little bit of advantage pulling it back with the super firing arrangement if you had it conventionally laid out. It would be a little bit, but every little helps. Also, because all the guns, well, except for obviously the first two turrets, are quite spaced out, that does complicate the range finding and fire control solutions for your fire control systems a little bit, because when the fire control solution is calculated, it's calculated off a datum point that is commensurate with usually either the center of the ship or the rangefinder, depending on exactly who's doing it. And then, of course, that has to be adjusted very slightly because the guns physically aren't where that datum point is. Now, if you have a pair of super firing turrets, or two super firing turrets forward if you're using triples and one aft, or you're a Renown with two twins forward and one aft, then you've got one aft set to think about if you've got a single aft turret, and two closely spaced datum points, so relatively minimal changes in the calculations there, or if you've got four turrets in two super firing pairs, again, two sets of two closely spaced datum points, so it is easier to calculate. Whereas in this scenario, you've got two very widely separated datum points and then two closely spaced datum points, so it just makes your fire control calculations that little bit more complicated. And then, of course, you have turret and magazine fires. Now, obviously, a turret and magazine fire is never a good thing wherever it happens, but small mercies if you have a more conventional turret layout and, let's say, X turret or its magazine catches fire, assuming it doesn't catastrophically detonate and blow you in half anyway, where can that fire spread? Well, okay, fair enough, it can spread to the other magazine if it's right next to it, so I suppose maybe that's a very small plus in favour of this layout. But in the other direction, it will spread towards the engine rooms, but the engine rooms aren't particularly flammable, so I mean, it's not great, but the engines can actually operate even if the engine room has to be evacuated for a short period of time unmanned. Whereas with this layout, if X turret catches fire, well, it's going to spread to the engines. Okay, well, we just covered that. But it's also right next to the boilers, and the boilers really can't be left unattended for particularly extended periods of time. And, should the turret go off, well, it's now spaced directly between the two largest void spaces, if you like, in the ship. So if X turret cooks off in a way that is not immediately fatal to the ship, but is quite heavily damaging, it's probably going to kill the ship anyway through massive flooding. Now, granted, that's a very marginal negative, but a negative nonetheless. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Hope you've enjoyed it, and hope to see you again in another video soon. Thanks for now.